we weren't ripped out of our context unwillingly and then beaten until we assimilated the way that the black slaves were. So the idea of a black American identity is necessary, whereas the idea of a white American identity is not necessary. It's an interesting critique that's going on right now in the black community about the difference between the two, why it's not just two equivalent choices. There's a power differential and a historical differential between them.
If you open up your YouTube app on your phone now, there's like a BHM logo now in the top left corner, which I was first confused about.
Nice.
It's strictly performative, especially in Google's case, I'd say.
But of course.
So
Sharon.
I watched a very good documentary this weekend, and I just attended a conversation with the producers of that documentary. It comes from Atlantic Magazine, and it was called White Noise. And it followed three people from the alt-right movement. It was very informative and very fascinating. And part of being an intellectual is being able to see things from both sides,
yes.
appreciate different opinions,
yes.
and sometimes modify your own.
Yes.
And sometimes you don't modify your own. That's part of it. But this was an absolutely fascinating documentary. It's now on Amazon, the producer said. But here was the paradox. These were three, the thing that stuck out to me. These were three young people, all under 30, two men and a girl. And they were white nationalists, they said so. But when it come to their intimate partners, none of them were white. That blew my socks off.
Mm-hmm.
And so the producers said, well, white nationalism is a spectrum. It's an ideological spectrum, and the implementation is varied. So that was very interesting to me. But so I recommend it. It's on Amazon now. White Noise.
Thank you. I'll watch that. Yeah. I appreciate the recommendation.
It's if I've kind of looked into this a little further and along a different angle, and I don't want to paint a complete broad brush, but there's definitely this current that underscores certain mixed race relationships, particularly with a white male and Asian female, in that there's a desire for that submissiveness, which was more common in Asian female mates that they were able to find in particular situations, of Korean War, Vietnam War, war veterans. I'm not saying all relationships, are that, and I think it also kind of, you see it coincide with white women in this continent gaining more power. So you see kind of those opposing kind of forces at work.
Good observation and correct fact.
So there's a lot of paradox and subtlety and nuance and complication to this subject, and that was certainly the stomping grounds of Heraclitus and Hegel. So our topic may not lie squarely athwart, but it intersects. Marianne, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
No, I think instead of thinking of it as power, because I always equate power with power over, I think that women are now being recognized for having intelligence and having an ability to do input from a different angle. So I believe that.
Thank you.
I do as well. The troubling issue that I find often, and other writers have written against this, is if they're still put into a power structure that is deeply hierarchical and unjust, it's just sort of making this power hierarchy kind of, multicolored, as some would say. Kind of seeing, for example, women, corporate leaders and how they're basically expected just to, behave as male corporate leaders did, and if anything, like sometimes that insecurity forces them, to kind of like make sure that to even up the ante.
Oh.
So,
I ask a question before we start, because I was confused about your discussion today.
Sure.
And it's a operational question, and my philosophical understanding, the lack of it, led me here. So you're going to talk about the dialectics today, right?
Yes.
So I that was a new word for me. So
Yeah.
I looked at its varied meanings, and then that led me to types of philosophical arguments. So I came on things like deduction, inductive, critical reasoning, philosophy, Socratic, dialectic. And so what I want you to do for me is to put all of those together.
just a quick overview of the entire field of epistemology.
No, just two sentences, because you're going to talk about dialectics, and my definition of it is a method of philosophical argument which involves a contradictory process between opposite sides. So I see thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. I get that.
So right? Yes, I'm happy to do that. In fact, the whole opening I have planned for this is to answer your question. You once again started by saying I'm no philosopher. I just have this question, and of course, it's the central question of today. So,
it's going to be the most meaningful 2 sentences that we ever get. I'll tell you that.
Once again, Sharon, you've deeply philosophized while claiming to be nothing of the sort. So. About the dialectic, I have to start by reinforcing a disclaimer that I give from time to time. Ginny will often praise me and call me, Professor Marshall, and I say I'm just a student. I'm now going to prove that I'm just a student, and I'm going to prove it in the most dramatic possible way. The subject of dialectics I have explained in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And I've talked about this being Hegel's conception of how to do philosophy. Do you know what Hegel had to say about thesis, antithesis, synthesis? He said that is not his system at all, and he has complete contempt for it.
Really?
I've been using the terminology that Hegel hates more than anything in the world to describe his system. So let's begin right there. The reason
I've heard this, but like I don't fully understand the whole backstory, so it's sort of like it's confusing.
I'm going to explain that in order to answer Sharon's question.
Yeah.
I'm going to explain that in order to answer Sharon's question. So the gist is this. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis is a terminology that comes from Kant. Now, as you may recall from earlier sessions, I've alluded to the fact that Hegel and Kant had a long-standing feud that was so strong that later Kantians blamed Hegel for the Holocaust as an attempt to, to show how bad Hegel was, right? And there are Hegelians who do the opposite and blame the Kantians for the Holocaust. So there is this enormous emotionally charged tug of war. So one could initially understand why Hegel wouldn't want to completely embrace the terminology of Kant. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that terminology was picked up by 2 later German philosophers, Fichte and Schelling. And Hegel developed out of that tradition in response to it, in reaction to it. He was reacting against Kant, reacting against Fichte, reacting against Schelling. So let me put their names here just so people can, oh yeah, there it is. Fichte and Schelling, right? Like so. So they were developing this idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And the dialectic, as I've described it, contains elements, because I've been Hegelianizing it, it contains Hegelian elements that were not present in Kant, Fichte, or Schelling. And what I've been doing is blurring the lines across an enormous philosophical argument that's been going on for centuries. And I've been doing that in order to apply the terminology that Hegel rejected to Hegel. Now, I'm not the first one to do that. I'm following in a long tradition. There was a philosopher after Hegel named Calabius, and he specifically took the thesis, antithesis, synthesis terminology and overlaid it on top of Hegel in direct violation of what Hegel said you should absolutely not do. And he did it, and that description of Hegel's dialectic became more popular than Hegel's own description. So if you pick up books on Marxist dialectics, for example, they will all be using the thesis, antithesis, synthesis explanation of the dialectic. But Hegel's criticism of that explanation remains trenchant. And what we're going to talk about now is what that is. In the chat, I pointed you guys to a book by Walter Kaufmann called Hegel, Texts and Commentary. This is the halfway decent translation of the prologue, the foreword, sorry, rather, of the Philosophy of Geist, which is where I keep going back to for one of the cleanest descriptions of Hegel's dialectic. Now, when I say halfway decent, that's as high a praise as I can give to any translation of Hegel, because Hegel's extraordinarily difficult to translate. Usually attempts to translate Hegel come back as gibberish. So yeah, let me put the name in here again. And in Walter Kaufmann's translation, you may remember Walter Kaufmann did all the Nietzsche translations. He was the one who rescued Nietzsche. Before Kaufmann, everybody thought Nietzsche was an anti-Semite and a proto-Nazi. And Kaufmann was the first one who showed that impression was a lie created by Nietzsche's own sister and her anti-Semitic boyfriend, who repurposed Nietzsche's works, tore him apart, and put him back together to make him seem to be foreshadowing the greatness and glory of what would later become Nazism. In direct violation of Nietzsche, who was spinning in his grave because there's nothing he despised as much as anti-Semitism, and also he also despised the German period of self-flattery, bombast, we're the greatest, we're the best, all the stuff that Nazism embodied was what Nietzsche was against. And somehow he'd been turned inside out by his own sister and her boyfriend, and it stayed that way for decades until Kaufmann finally came in with his translations and said, you guys all have this wrong. If you go back to Nietzsche, Nietzsche's saying the opposite. So I was excited to see that Kaufmann tackled Hegel, because Hegel is, I think, the hardest translation from the German I've encountered. I just haven't seen a good one yet. I was disappointed to discover he only really did one or two books, and he only really translated the foreword of the Philosophy of Geist. Sorry, the Phenomenology of Geist. But as he points out, the foreword to the Phenomenology of Geist is Hegel's masterwork. It is where he was about to publish the Phenomenology of Geist, and he had second thoughts. He thought, I don't think my book is all that understandable, says Hegel to himself in one of the greatest understatements of philosophical history. And he says, I should write a foreword to make it easier for people to ramp up and get started and be able to read this. And so he concentrated down his whole theory of how philosophy works and how the mind works into what's actually not a short foreword at all, but a significant extended discussion. But step by step, it introduces the ideas. And so Kaufmann said, I don't need to translate the rest of it. If I just translate this part and I do a good job on it and introduce it properly, then armed with that, you'll then be able to read other Hegel translations and other Hegel works and decode them using what you learned from this. So I strongly recommend this book. I only ran into it 2 weeks ago when I was discovering how badly awry I went on thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and why we should just jettison that terminology from our Hegelian discussion entirely. And with that in mind, I'm now going to attempt to describe more clearly what Hegel meant in a way that shows why he didn't like that terminology.
Book is Text and Commentary?
Texts and Commentary. Hegel, Texts and Commentary.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And it's actually in ebook form too, unlike most Hegel. So you can get a copy of it. So there is a sentence in this book, which I'm going to bring up now and read to you. Well, I'll read to you a little paragraph, and it's got the key sentence in it. And this will help to show the core difference, which we'll then talk about. Okay, here goes the paragraph. Oh, and by the way, one of the many blessings of Kaufmann's translation is that he says, unlike Nietzsche and some other German writers who are real stylists, Hegel's style is ... problematic. Hegel's sort of an anti-stylist. His style works against understanding his own material, his choice of vocabulary, his run-on sentences, his paragraphs that go on for page after page after page of just a single paragraph. And when he does make little annotations, maybe you could break the paragraph here, he chooses badly. He chooses like an alien intelligence attempting to guess what a human intelligence would find comprehensible. So Kaufmann freely, he said, he admits up front, he freely decided to break up the paragraphs completely differently from the way that Hegel does in order to try to make more sense of them. So the paragraph I'm going to read does not go on for sentences. It's just a normal size paragraph.
Can it be shared to the screen?
Yeah, why don't I share to the screen?
Yeah.
Thanks, Richard.
Don't agree with your evaluation about Hegel's writing. I agree that it's impossible to read, but I think if you can't read it the way he wrote it, then you're not actually understanding Hegel.
Well, that's not my evaluation. That's Kaufmann's evaluation.
No, I agree that it's difficult to read.
Right. So when you're reading Kaufmann, you just have to know that that's what he was thinking, and so that he did his paragraph breaks differently.
I adore Kaufmann.
Yeah, we're not reading Hegel. We're reading Kaufmann's reading of Hegel.
That's all I was trying to emphasize.
But you're not getting Hegel if you are paraphrasing it into something else, is what I'm saying.
No, we agree. I think we all agree.
The style, as the expression goes, the style is the man. The way that it's written is part of what it means. That's all.
Yeah, and I've got Hegel in German here. I've got the original, and I go back and forth between them trying to translate. But I thought today I would not inflict that upon the rest of you, because
thank you.
You probably all don't speak German, and if you did, you still wouldn't necessarily be prepared to dive into Hegel in German. So let's do a little Kaufmann in English. He says, opinion considers the opposition of what is true and false quite rigid. And confronted with a philosophical system, it expects agreement or contradiction. Now, this is, stepping aside for a sec, this is what we've been discussing for the past couple of months about the law of the excluded middle, right? About the tendency of Verstand to try to simplify things into binary opposites and form a system of logic out of that. And that's definitely what Hegel's talking about here. It's what he's standing in opposition to. And in explanation of such a system, opinion still expects to find one or the other. It does not comprehend the difference of the philosophical systems in terms of the progressive development of the truth, but sees only contradiction in this difference. And here's the sentence, the big payoff to understand Hegel's dialectic. The bud disappears as the blossom bursts forth, and one could say that the former is refuted by the latter. In the same way, the fruit declares the blossom to be a false existence of the plant, and the fruit supplants the blossom as the truth of the plant. These forms do not only differ, they also displace each other because they're incompatible. Their fluid nature, however, makes them at the same time elements of an organic unity in which they not only do not conflict, but in which one is as necessary as the other, and it is only this equal necessity that constitutes the life of the whole. That tries to strike to the very heart of Hegel's concept of the dialectic. It's not just any two things you happen to pick up and put in opposition to each other, right? It is that we are talking about a single organic system developing through stages over time, and that those stages are not any more arbitrary than the stages of embryogenesis that leads from a fertilized egg to a human being. This is the core. This is the heart of the Hegelian dialectic, because for Hegel, the point of the dialectic and the point of his whole system of philosophy is that it should not be imposed by an intellectual upon nature, but rather it should be discovered within nature as nature's own dialectic, not an artificial framework asserted on top of it. And in saying this, he's rejecting the Verstand approach of Kant and others and saying our systems that satisfy us are not as important as the true system of nature that it's our duty to investigate and explore. I find the contradictions within and the developments through. So I'm going to pause there for a second, and I'll go to questions. I'm going to take this off the screen for a sec. Let's see who else got questions.
We've been reading the Hegel's philosophy of nature in this other group, and he seems to begin with the notion that we have a notion of what the philosophy of nature is, and I'm not sure. So the idea that we have of nature is how we begin to understand what nature is.
This is why I don't like any translations of Hegel, because the word notion is an English word, and he didn't write in English, so he didn't write the word notion. That's some translator's idea of what an English word could be that would stand for begriff. And the problem is we don't have any English words that mean what begriff means. And even if we flail about among the words that we do have and try to bend one of them to fit the idea of begriff, notion in English is way too vague to be an equivalent to or a stand-in for begriff. We might say experience. We might say immersion, or we sort of struggle. We just don't have the words. Right. But it's definitely not notion. That's like. Okay. But I've got right here. I've got my Hegel books, and in these Hegel books, you're right. Many of the translators pick up the word notion and say, I know, let's use the word notion for begriff, which is part of why these translations are borderline gibberish, because it's like, it points in the opposite direction from where Hegel's trying to point you with his terminology. Sharon, go ahead.
Well, this is just for clarification here. So as I struggle to understand the word dialectic,
yes,
opposites was a difficult concept for me.
Yes.
So that sentence that you just read tells me that a blossom is different from a fruit, and whereas they're opposites, it's part of an evolution. So does that add new meaning to the dialectical process? That it's part of a function? It's functional?
Yes, exactly. Hegel's when Hegel wrote elsewhere that there wasn't a single proposition of Heraclitus's that he didn't make central to his own philosophy, it's so easy to assume that he's just exaggerating or being imprecise, but he means it precisely. What he's doing is he's going back to the Greek concept of nature as an organism, as biology, not mechanism, being the fundamental metaphor for everything. That if we want to understand contradiction and opposites in dialectics, we need to understand them as an organism, as a living system, the same way that we would understand embryogenesis. And he would argue then that that's how we should understand chemistry and physics. And even the most mechanical fields that we can imagine, we need to bring back the true organicism of nature to comprehend them as they actually are, and not get trapped into Verstand reflex towards mechanisms and systems and mathematizing and the excluded middle. Because part of what distinguishes mechanical systems is that they're built off the excluded middle. So they're made of parts, and the parts are separate from each other, and they're manufactured and designed separately, and then they're assembled, but the parts remain separate even as they interact with each other. They are not part of a whole. They're part of something we may call a whole. We can call a toaster a whole, but it's obviously not a whole if we compare it to a cat, because it didn't emerge from order that it contains within itself through successive iterative stages of organic development. It's a construct. It's a Frankenstein. And actual living systems, they have an internal teleology, whether it's in DNA, whether it's in hormones, whether it's in any number of things, that in which in some physical or immanental essential way, they know themselves and try to become themselves, which is why when they're injured, they heal themselves to try to restore themselves to what they were. And it's why when you break a toaster, it doesn't try to heal itself. It's not actually a whole of any kind. Sharon, you had your hand up.
That's just absolutely fascinating, Rick, because this takes me back to my early days of embryology.
Yes.
And when you have the initial fertilization, right? The initial sex, if you look on it, it's almost neutral, but it's basically female. And then the differentiation goes on based on the genotype to become male. And you have disorders of sexuality and gender depending on the hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex and the mother doing that whole process. So when you talk about nature and opposite and the teleology that's there, that's just so fascinating to me.
Yeah. I mean, he strikes to the heart of what Kenneth Smith talks about when he says the ancient worldview was fundamentally different from our worldview. And it's very hard for us to understand how that can be true. We want them to be either just like us or a primitive version of us. We don't want them to be actually fundamentally other, seeing the world in ways that we can't see, understanding things that we can't understand, because our basal assumptions rule out those possibilities. The idea that the world is not a mechanism in which life is some kind of weird miracle or aberration, but rather that all of the universe, all the way down to its most seemingly mechanical parts like quarks and gluons, is nevertheless an organismic whole. It's more like life than it is like a machine. That's like, we can't think that way. We're taught not to think that way. The excluded middle won't let us think that way. And yet, none of us would exist if it weren't for the fundamental organic unfolding truth of that very organicism that we're trained to deny. It's like, if we look at an adult human being who had a birth defect that led to some kind of systemic disorder, and we try to say, what is that person doing wrong now? We're asking the wrong question, because we're pretending that they exist only in the present, when the actual problem was during embryogenesis and the process of unfolding. Only through understanding the thing that exists now as a process of unfolding can we see where the path was taken off of the track that would have led to vitality and is instead led into the disorder that they're stuck with. And so it is, Hegel says, with ideas. If you just try to go at them as, are they true or are they false? Do I agree or do I disagree? You're making the exact same Verstand kind of excluded middle mistake, in which you're not seeing that the ideas arose for a reason from a successive process of unfolding, and that where they went wrong isn't now, but somewhere back in the past. And it's when you find that point of, derivation that's gone wrong that you can begin to see why the ideas are incorrect at a more fundamental and essential level than if you just try to critique it right now as a set of ideas in abstracto. James, then Richard.
So you're saying that the idea of contradiction and that leads to this kind of dialectic is a kind of mistranslation of what Hegel means by contradiction, or how the how the translations are say it's a contradiction, but in this organic process, there's not necessarily a contradiction from one phase to another, is there?
So this is where it gets interesting. Let's go back to this paragraph, because he addresses this point directly. He says there is a contradiction, and he says there is not a contradiction, and that both things are true at the same time. That what we have here is not actually a contradiction, but a paradox of the Heraclitean variety, in which, from a mortal perspective, looking at things aspectively from one side or another, we oversimplify the truth of the situation down to one answer or the other, and both answers only capture part of the truth while rejecting part of the truth. To see the wholeness of it, we have to expand our model to be able to have more nuance and more understanding, in which we see that it both contradicts and doesn't contradict. So here he says, right here, that the fruit declares the blossom to be a false existence, that they displace each other because they're incompatible. But then he says at the same time, not only don't they conflict, but they're necessary. And so he's directly pitting against each other the idea that it's a contradiction and the idea that it's not a contradiction. And he's trying to do the thing that Kant wouldn't do, which is to say the truth of nature transcends our excluded middle. It can be both a contradiction and not a contradiction at the same time, because it's a deeper paradox caused by our limited understanding of the full scope of what's happening before us. Richard, then Anna.
Yeah, so like I'm trying to figure out how to formulate my thought here. Okay. Like the understanding of things as a system, like I think it's like it's so not to trash Hegel here, but or whatever. But, or actually,
feel free.
Okay, I think I'll get this out of the way and I'll help clarify my mind. I think, like, I guess the whole idea of synthesis, antithesis, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis is more. It's kind of become sort of this popularization of and reduction of Hegel's ideas. Maybe not a translation, but maybe has something to do with it. But I guess like
we could blame Calabeus. He was the one who did that to Hegel.
Okay. Like kind of in our poor way of understanding the world, like so we have ways of dealing with science that work well, but they don't really extend into all spaces very well. So like just the idea of like having an independent variable and controlling it, and but like it seems to me, and maybe someone can correct me if it doesn't have the case, but like when it comes for us to like understanding complex ecosystems and stuff, like we seem like horribly inadequate or woefully inadequate in trying to understand, manage, or even just understand, I guess, or we're mismanaging it. And like I guess what's kind of frightening is like with kind of the climate crisis happening, which is not just global warming, but that's like one of the most major aspects of it. But there's also ocean acidification and other so there's a camp that believes that we should do geoengineering by basically releasing, actually, like one of those folks is up in the Seattle area, like the former I forgot his name, but he was the former CTO of Microsoft, right? Like basically releasing like kind of a form of what was natural pollution, but like sulfurous compounds to basically reduce the amount of light reaching the surface to counteract the greenhouse effect of carbon dioxide. Anyway, that's kind of frightening.
Yeah, I mean, it puts you right in mind if there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. My brother and I were talking the other day while we were practicing Kabuto in the backyard about kudzu and the way invasive species spread because they're missing their natural predators. And when you take them out of the total harmony of the system that they're supposed to be a part of, they become unbalanced. They're missing now their balancing factors and they become a problem. But if you try to respond to that by introducing more invasive species, the ones that are naturally suited, for example, to take on kudzu and keep it under control, then you just have a second unbalanced system because, okay, fine, now the kudzu is balanced, but now the predator is not balanced. And you end up, just multiplying the problem. And it's what's bizarre is the extent to which kindergarten children can learn this nursery rhyme that warns about following up unintended consequences by doing more of the same kind of action. And yet we still have theoretically highly educated, intelligent adults who propose exactly the same thing for solving ecological and climate crises. We're trying to think with the wrong tools. We're trying to think with non-organismic, non-systemic tools. We're trying to think with mechanical tools that, one tweezer at a time. I'll just introduce this one finite act, and surely it will only have one finite consequence, the one I intended, and not a whole raft of other consequences that I didn't intend. So Anna, and then Sharon.
Yeah, well, I think for me, the idea that homosexuality, for example, is a birth defect is a little bit offensive.
I didn't say that.
I just want to put that out there. And also, the general trend of the conversation is making sense to me as far as to the extent that I understand Hegel, but it's definitely not a linear cause and effect explanation. It's not a Newtonian. It's not about time unfolding in that kind of a way.
Agreed.
So
agreed.
You just have to be careful not to look for explanations in the past and draw conclusions in that way, because of course those results had their causes as well, and the causes are, at least in Hegel, very complicated and not not, as you say, mechanical. So that's a good line of thought.
Yeah, so you're right that it's So first of all, of course, anytime we talk about birth defects and so on, yeah, we've got all these social problems with people trying to attribute normal, healthy phenomena to being some kind of defect. But I was thinking about things more like thalidomide, and the way that the thalidomide babies were born as a result of a change at a critical step in embryogenesis. And that if you look at the resulting adult, you can't figure out why they look the way they do. Why are they missing the limbs that they're missing? But if you go back to the stage of embryogenesis where the drug interfered with the differentiation, then it makes perfect sense why the adult would manifest the way that they do. And so it's not, you're right, Anna, there too, it's not just not, we don't want to misapply this, but that the more valuable part is not looking at it in terms of time, but looking at it in terms of the organic whole, the unfolding of the whole, that it's a complete system, not just a series of successions that just happen to be linked together by time. Sharon, go ahead.
I like that last sentence that you just said. When you look at it, look at embryogenesis, you have to look at the organic whole and the way it evolves. And over the years, in the medical community, we not talk about gender fluidity, because gender fluidity has everything to do. Oh, I think I am echoing. Gender fluidity has everything to do with the way embryology evolved. The thalidomide is important because that was an exogenous agent that was introduced into the system.
Yes.
And when you look at some transgender states where you have enzyme defects in the adrenal cortex that produce a hermaphrodite-looking child. I've been in the delivery room many times, and this human being comes out and you say, what's that? Right? Very seriously. And that's because you have disorders. And I've been around long enough to see, to be part of the time when you say, what's that? To where you said, well, we can get a bar body, we can see what the genotype is, we can correct that enzymatic defect. And so you don't grow up thinking you're a girl when you're really a boy, right? And this comes back to dialectic.
Yes.
How you hold, and help me with this, how you hold two opposing things as they evolve, two opposing different entities as they evolve from a whole. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, and I'm going to expand on it a little bit before I let Anna go, and that's that there are times where what you're looking at is a defect from a healthy line of development. But
absolutely.
There are also times when what you're looking at is normal variation because it is in the nature of our species to produce not only male and female, but a number of intersex
correct
individuals, because nature abhors a monoculture. Right? Our survival depends upon our flexibility, our ability to respond to unpredictable things that happen. And so nature naturally produces variation so that at least somebody in the population will be well suited to whatever random thing happens that we couldn't foresee. Where we get into trouble of the kind that Anna was talking about is where we confuse an unhealthy defect in development with a normal variation of development. And that's something that, for example, was very prevalent in Germany around the time of the Holocaust. There's the constant desire to enforce rigid gender stereotypes. There must, males must be toxically, stereotypically male. Females must be incredibly submissive, and there should be nobody in between. And if there are, we have to exterminate them because, our idea is that those are unhealthy. And so what you end up with is Verstand attempting to impose an excluded middle upon a nature that's trying to produce a whole range of variations that Verstand doesn't recognize the importance of.
Spectrum.
Yeah. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, so at least the kind of stuff that was built in the continental tradition that was built on Heidegger and from Hegel, both of which were going back to the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, argues against the idea that anything is really some other thing. It argues against the idea that anything is like something that you can define. It's much more an idea of things being in motion, so that there aren't really nouns. There's all verbs. So I would just say that from a Heraclitus standpoint, that's the idea.
Yeah.
If you see some situation, it's temporary.
Yeah.
It's not that you don't need to, that you can't make decisions and everything's just a complete chaos and confusion, but it's not stable in that kind of rational way.
Well, boy, that's an outstanding point, Anna. That when we talk about English or other languages being difficult to having a difficult time expressing these ideas, one easy way to illustrate that is the idea of nouns and verbs, which we take for granted. We've been formatted that way since we were real little. And in English, it's normal to assume the nouns are the real things and the verbs are what they do. And so that enforces a kind of Cartesian monadism in which we think that the individual thing is the reality, and that within the reality, it then moves around and does the things that it wants to do. The idea that the relationship between the part and the whole is vastly more complicated and organic than that the part is necessary to the whole existing, but the whole is also necessary to the part existing. And that even each part is itself a whole made up of other parts, and that it needs them and they need it. That there's these complex layers of interdependency, and that's the normal state of natural systems. This interdependency, this flow, these interactions. This is almost inexpressible in English. You could see why it was so easy to hit up physics and chemistry first and make a lot of progress, and then be lagging way behind on ecology and other kinds of complex organic systems level thinking, because our language itself doesn't encourage us to do that well. And where you can see some of this come out is if you learn a language that's built on a very different principle, like Hopi or Navajo, which are two languages which are completely, by the way, unrelated to each other.
Mhm.
But in Hopi, even more than Navajo, but in both of them, verbs are more important than nouns. In Navajo, a huge number of things that we would do with nouns or adjectives or adverbs are instead done by synthesizing these vast verbs. And many things are described as states or conditions or transformations rather than as individuals. And that's even more pronounced in Hopi. And so you could imagine how, if you thought in a paradigm of becoming and transformation in which nouns were subordinate to these processes, the world would look very different to you. You'd be able to, some things would be easier for you to express than you can express in English, where the noun is the king and everything else is subordinate to it. I think we had Marianne, then James, then Joseph.
So when you were talking about nouns and verbs, I started to think of Bucky Fuller, who said that he is not a noun, but a verb. Yes, and I thought that is a sign of a creative intellect.
Yes.
And also when you were talking about nature of horrors of monoculture, I thought of our agricultural system right now.
Yeah, right. We desperately try to create these vast swaths of monocultures, and then we use multiple kinds of poisons to kill multiple kingdoms of life to get them out of that area to enforce the monoculture. And then we're always shocked when it doesn't end well. It's like, well, we have done this. James, you still want to go? Yeah, so you put your hand down.
Yeah, I think Joe was first.
Okay, Joe, go ahead.
I'm actually still gathering my thoughts a little bit, but the way I'm
Okay.
looking at this is in a systems thinking approach, and understanding how to understand the whole and the relationship between the interactions that create the whole, and or understand the interactions between the system itself. So I think about it in terms of a biological system of just a human being. You have your heart, your pancreas, and all these things that make up, and then you're the whole, and you're incomplete without that whole, right? And that in your ecosystem analysis, like saying, okay, if a predator is taken out of its ecosystem, then there's an imbalance per se. So then how do you analyze the interactions? That's the question I'm trying to get my head around right now. It's just I'm just trying to understand. I'm not forming my question well. It's just understanding the interactions within the system, and then that I'm kind of struggling with a little bit. Does that make sense a little?
Yeah, and it's the struggle we need to have, in order
Right.
to and this, by the way, goes right to Hegel, to get out of the mindset that we're in, right, which is our thesis, if we were going to use the wrong terms, to get out of the mindset we're in into another mindset and be able to see the world organically involves a struggle against the current mindset, that we find that we're having difficulty expressing ideas, and that we eventually figure out it's the mindset itself that's blocking us, and its terminology is blocking us from being able to say those things. And so we start to push ourselves, we negate it in Hegel's terminology. We start to push away from it to unfold a new layer of order that couldn't be expressed within the old paradigm. And this is what Hegel's talking about when he says that the flower has to unfold from the bud. If it stays limited to the bud, you're never going to get to the seed and a new tree. It's got to push against budness to create floweriness. There's an opposition that develops, and it's not an opposition imposed from without by a philosopher attempting to explain his grand theorem. It's the bud itself trying to escape its own limitations by transforming itself to a new stage of order. And so going through that process is inherently a struggle. And what you're talking about as you struggle to figure out how do you think about these things and express these things, that is the struggle to emerge from the mechanized worldview that we're educated into, to try to think in terms of this kind of organicist Hellenic / Hegelian worldview that Hegel's into. So you're right on point.
That clears up a lot for me. Thank you for that explanation specifically.
Sure. Richard, then James, then Sharon.
Yeah, kind of further to this idea of like noun versus verb. I'm kind of tying this to, I think, like things I've kind of, maybe mentioned just briefly in chat and stuff. But, now, like, philosophers in mind, and also like, also kind of along with neuroscience, like, like they really kind of they don't really see the self as this really kind of coherent, very permanent thing. Thomas Metzinger likes to say, like, the self is a process. I'll put a quick link to, like, you can order one of his condensed down, like, more approachable books.
Oh, good. Thanks, Richard.
And I think, like, even when we make a decision, there's kind of different parts of your mind that are kind of giving you different signals, right? And so, and additionally, kind of studying René Girard, and also I think this is also kind of looked at through different, independently through different kind of mechanisms as well. It's like the self is mediated to other selves. Like these different processes are interacting. And so it's definitely kind of, I think an organismic way of looking at it, just beyond like my own body and mind, like that really helps me to see kind of what's going on in our weird and crazy world these days.
Yeah. There's a couple of developments that have led to the popularization of these kinds of models in recent, I guess, the last half century. And one of them was, as physics ran into the unexpected, I guess you'd have to call them paradoxes, that relativity and quantum physics introduced. And I don't mean the popularization of quantum physics. I mean actual quantum physics. When you put aside all the pop books and you go right at what are they struggling with? What were the physicists struggling with in the early 20th century with quantum physics? You discover that both it and relativity were introducing aspects of reality that could not be explained through mechanism. The Newtonian is the classic representation of the mechanistic portrayal of physics. And in both cases, they had to do very weird, from a Newtonian perspective, very weird things to our conception of the building blocks of the universe, because we couldn't go any further. The explanation had run out, and we could see phenomena in the real world that would not fit in Newton. And as we did that forced us to start to think, oh God, well, what else is there other than mechanism? So this demand for an alternative system of explanations was being driven by physics itself, which is, ironically, you would normally think the least organismic, biological of the sciences, right? But as that got into play, we had Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the development of the science of ecology, which was saying that our approach to the world of treating everything mechanistically, one topic at a time in vitro, was killing us and killing the ecosystem, and that we needed to develop a new systems level of thinking, which was the only way to be able to understand ecology enough to be able to interact with it well. And the combination, I think it is the fertilization of relativity and quantum physics from physics on the one hand, with the development of ecology on the other, that's led people to go back and re-examine all of our models from all of our sciences and say, does this have to be explained mechanistically as a pseudo-Newtonianism, or is there some systems level, stretchy relativity quantum way to think about these things that is still scientifically valid, but that breaks free of the trap of mechanism? Because now that we see the trap of mechanism, can we break out of it in all these different fields? And it sort of led to this explosion of creativity. James, then Sharon.
Yeah, Hegel, there's translations and seem to indicate that he's interested in mainly what the Geist is, that is, he hopes to find in nature. And is that Geist, is that what can that be translated as the whole? Is that what, how?
Well, Geist is a problem for us because here again, in German, it means some clear things that it doesn't mean. I mean, in English, we don't have any words that mean that. So you see half the translations of the phenomenology of Geist call it the phenomenology of spirit, and the other half call it the phenomenology of the mind, because it's mind and spirit at the same time in German.
Right.
And in mind, it has this, if we're looking for English equivalents, it has this deeper connotation of the intelligence of things. Right. So even something that has no brain, we could look at and say, well, there's a lot of intelligence in its design, or things that evolve into harmonious relationships, even though there's not necessarily a designer and there's not necessarily a brain anywhere involved that sat back and said, I'm going to harmonize these things. We can say there's sort of an intelligent harmony that has evolved into place. And so when we start to talk about intelligence in these ways, we're getting a little closer to Hegel's meaning of Geist, I think.
So is that kind of a pantheism then, that eventually, it leads to a kind of pantheism, that a consciousness is, everywhere?
Well, pantheism is a challenge for us because typically when we try to understand pantheism, we're doing it retrospectively, right? Every pantheist in the modern era is a wannabe pantheist. They're trying to make themselves from what they were raised as, which is absolutely not pantheistic, into what that kind of a person imagines a pantheist would be like. And it's a challenge for us. We for example, will want the mind of nature to be a literal mind, and that it is thinking literal thoughts the way that we think them. And that's sort of what we imagine when we imagine pantheism. But that's not the Greek conception at all. If we look at Heraclitus, he talks relentlessly about the logos, the capital L logos, by which he means the intelligence of that is there for us to see everywhere within nature, the harmonization of things, that they form a cosmos and not a chaos. We can imagine a universe that would have fallen apart under its own activities, in which entropy was king, the way that we used to think entropy was king in early 20th century and 19th century physics. But that's not the one that we're in. We're in a universe that coheres into a cosmos in which it reinforces itself. And regardless of whether anything or anybody is thinking any thoughts, there is this kind of systemic structural intelligence to it in which it makes sense. And it makes sense in a way that generates wholes, so that successively it unfolds over and over intelligently over time into greater and greater levels of organization, where each new level of organization, instead of being a complete refutation of the previous one, as Hegel says, there's somehow at the same time a refutation, but also a continuation and a necessary development. That this is the paradox for us in understanding the intelligence of the universe, that it is so good at harnessing the paradox of pushing away the other while simultaneously continuing and expanding the other, which is something we can't do when we do things mechanistically. So that's the kind of intelligence that Hegel and Heraclitus and the Greeks are talking about, this kind of intrinsic, immanentalist, implicit intelligence that somehow is this clever, creative, organismic whole, even though it doesn't necessarily ever think a thought the way that we would think of a thought, and doesn't have a mind the way that we would think of a mind. It's something deeper and more profound than what we do when we think. which is why, as we said last week, Heraclitus says human nature has no real understanding, only what encompasses it does.
Mhm.
Saying the kind of intelligence that we see in the cosmos is more profound and more successful and more creative than our own, even though it's not just just a better brain. It's not a brain at all. It's some other kind of intelligence. I don't know if that helps answer James, but that's kind of some of the stuff that I imagine Hegel would say in response, although he'd say it in a very Hegelian way instead of the way I did it. Sharon, go ahead.
This is my own imagination about this. Some other intelligence. I was reading about the concept of quantum entanglement, and I thought that was the secret life of particles. And when you
Yes.
the way they relate to each other, and when you come right down to the really micro level, that's the essence of the universe, because everything impacts each other. And you know, I forgot who laws it is. Every action is an equal and opposite reaction.
Newton.
So Newton. So when I'm reading about this quantum mechanics and how a particle here, the action of a particle here impacts a particle here, even though there is no direct connection. So they have a secret life, and that's what the universe is. That's the way I see it. Now, the other thing, the other concept, and you can expound on that in philosophical, sophisticated terms, but it's basically that. But the other thing that I thought of as you were talking about the synthesis and the thesis and the antithesis, I think we eventually come to synthesis. But the functionality and the perception of that synthesis depends on the process.
Right.
But it does happen.
It does.
Yes.
This is something that, you know, I mentioned this on a regular basis, but I'm going to put in the chats again. The Nature of Order is a 4-volume series by architect and philosopher Christopher Alexander. And it is packed with pictures. These are very big, very heavy books. They're basically picture books with a lot of text. And in The Nature of Order, he attempts to explicate what we're talking about. His first book is called The Phenomenon, and it's not the first book he wrote by any means, but the first volume in this series is called The Phenomenon of Life. And it's got the same name as an earlier book by Hans Jonas, but this is Christopher Alexander's book. And The Phenomenon of Life attempts to describe life not in terms of the cell and the things that we learn in biology, but in terms of geometry. And says, when we look at natural systems, what kinds of geometry do they create? How, you know, you've seen those memes on the internet where people are comparing an eye to a nebula, or they're comparing the large scale structure of the filaments of the universe to cell division and how the DNA strands pull apart into a spindle. There's this thing that people do colloquially where they find these correspondences between highly unlikely things. And what Christopher Alexander is saying is they are neither the same thing nor directly related, nor yet are they coincidences. It's not meaningless that these patterns recur, because these patterns, these geometric patterns, are the stuff of life itself. And they are what cells work to create. He does an inside-out theory of life. It's totally radically different from the way we normally think about it. And he does that.
Secret life.
Yeah, the secret life of the universe, he says, is not the organism. The organism is the fruit of life, not the life itself. And this goes way beyond Star Wars and the Force, right? This is an attempt to actually catalog what is the nature of living systems and how do they evolve. And the second book in the volume, in the series, is called The Process of Creating Life. And in this case, Sharon, he does what you were talking about. He flips it around and says, okay, now that we've talked about life, let's put that to the side and let's talk about embryogenesis. And let's talk about the unfolding, the successive unfolding of order, and how when order unfolds, it has to make something new and different from what it was before. But at the same time, it has to continue what was before, you know, whether in a transformed state or in a literal state. And it can't just 100% negate it as you know, to create an excluded middle. And instead, you know, the flower is related to the bud in many critical, essential ways, at the same time that it is obviously not a bud. And the same is true of the fruit. When the fruit unfolds, you could never look at a fruit and say, oh, look, it's a flower. I mean, you might say remnants of the flower around it, but a fruit is definitely its own thing. It's a totally new level of order that can't be reduced to its previous stage, but that couldn't have existed without its previous stage. So in this, Christopher Alexander is wrestling with and trying to, he shows lots of pictures, lots of diagrams, lots of examples from nature. It's a delightful read. He's illustrating what Hegel's talking about here with the flower and the bud and the fruit, and then applying it to, river deltas and how they evolve, or to the process of making a building, or doing a drawing. You can do drawings in the similar way where you unfold the order step by step. And if you do, you get a very different kind of thing than if you start with a grand design and just try to implement it directly. So those are only the first 2 of the 4 books in the series, but as a pair, they speak directly to what Sharon was talking about, because on the one hand, we talk about what is this life that we're attempting to describe. And then in the second book, we say, what is the process of creating life without which we can't really understand what life is? And that's what Hegel's saying. Hegel's dialectic is different from Kant's dialectic, because in Hegel's dialectic, it emerges from its own intrinsic order through its own processes of unfolding, in which we don't merely have some contradiction of things that argue against each other and get resolved, but we have the thing unfolding itself through successive stages of development. And that's why he doesn't like the terms thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Unfortunately, being Hegel, he didn't give us a really delightful, memorable trilogy of terms that we could use instead. But we'll come back to that problem in a bit. Richard, you got your hand up, and then Sharon.
Yeah, I just quickly posted a Google Books preview. I said preview, it should be preview, or you can click you can see some of the pages, I guess, from that book. I haven't clicked through it yet, but I was separately thinking about just kind of related to this essay and like myth and anti-myth.
Yes.
And it, I guess kind of it does kind of tie into, I guess, life, as we've been talking about, for some reason, just the metaphor of anti-myth, kind of as instead of being the oxygen we need, it's sort of like carbon monoxide, it kind of mimics the shape, but it kind of it gets in there, thinking that the cell thinks it's serving that same process, but it's really stopping us from breathing and getting what we need. And yeah,
that's a beautiful metaphor. I'm gonna. Is
that the same thing as amethia?
No. They're related. So let's take a second to talk about that, because that certainly brings today's and last week's topic right back to the overarching theme. So the idea of myth versus anti-myth, Kenneth Smith's argument that most things we call myths aren't myths at all, but are anti-myths. Richard, your metaphor of oxygen versus carbon monoxide is perfect. We have a need for myth, and it's not an appetite; it's a need. We have to have it. We can't survive without. We can't be sane without it. We can't be whole without it. We can't be sustainable without it. But modern culture doesn't give us myths. It gives us things it calls myths. And instead, they're anti-myths, and we have to keep getting more and more of them to temporarily satisfy the craving. They act more like a drug than they do like a healing. And one of the ways in which we can understand the difference between the two is if we take the myth of Oedipus. A modernist interpretation is this one guy did bad things, or the gods were mean for no reason and fated him to have bad things happen to him. But in either case, the point of the story from an anti-myth perspective like our own, and we live in an amythic culture, and so we interpret things anti-mythically. We think it's about Oedipus. We think the point is the one guy. And what myth would teach us is that where Oedipus went wrong is he thought the way we do. He tried to solve all of the problems of Thebes, one problem at a time, in isolation, as a separate thing. And he thought of himself in isolation as a separate person. And everything he did wrong was a violation of the larger whole that he was a part of, but that he wasn't aware of. And in fact, that his mindset didn't make him capable of even inquiring about or being curious about. If he'd been raised mythically, properly, he would never have gone halfway down this road without asking a whole bunch of questions that would have led him to act differently. So like he kills his own dad because he doesn't stop to wonder who his dad is, right? He marries his mother because he doesn't stop to wonder who his mother is. He assumes that the problem in Thebes is something that is happening rather than himself, because he sees himself in isolation as the problem solver, imposing a solution upon a broken situation. And he doesn't understand that he is the damage, and that every action he takes makes the damage worse because he is in violation of the whole, and every action violates the whole further. Now, myth teaches you the importance of seeing the big picture, seeing that we are part of a larger whole and that we need to understand what that whole is and how specifically we are related to it to avoid killing our dad, marrying our mother, and bringing catastrophe upon Thebes, right? We need to see, why we shouldn't just use pesticides willy-nilly because they help us with this one crop without thinking through what happens if we cause a catastrophe. What happens if we do this too successfully and we don't have insects? What if pollinators collapse in their populations? What will that do to us? The recursive feedback loops that we're part of, we need to start to think in terms of. And the point of myth was to make it so that even little kids can be comfortable thinking about the larger whole. Because if you aren't comfortable thinking about the larger whole, if that's not your natural idiom, it is way too easy to think about yourself as an isolated monad and to try to use mechanical solutions to system problems and thereby make them worse and bring about catastrophe, just like Oedipus did. So Anna, then Dowdy.
Yeah, I made this point in the Carl Jung group that I was at last night. Somebody here was there too, I think. But I don't see myths as primarily didactic in that sense. I don't think that they are purely allegorical. Symbols are not simply a cipher where you have one letter that actually stands for a different letter. It's not just a it's not necessarily solely a teaching tool. I think that there's an aesthetic dimension which is essential and not incidental to its purpose.
I'm with you. Yeah, it's part of why it's so hard to write true myths, because anytime you try to reduce them to anything, you're engaging in reductionism. You're applying a mechanical approach to their creation, when the whole point is that they need to unfold organically in order to illustrate the larger whole that we too are part of. And you also can't do it strictly by the book, by a recipe, because nature that we are attempting to illustrate through mythology is profound and full of mystery and contradictions and astonishing beauty. And when we try to do that, just sit down as an act of mechanical creation and do it, we can't replicate it. Human beings can't directly create things as profound as the world we're attempting to understand. And so there is this aspect in which the very thing that we criticize Homer for, that when we say, oh, he probably didn't actually write it, it probably evolved over time, because we explain it as, because as a pre-literate culture, people couldn't remember what the previous guy said. And so errors were introduced, deviations from the perfect original form in which the story came. And so over time, they weren't telling the same story as the original one. We see that as a process of corruption, because we think in terms of mechanisms in which the original design was perfect and every change becomes a deviation and a breakage. But of course, the part of what makes the myth is that they were never created as a perfect original form, but that they evolved over time through a process of unfolding as the culture interacted with itself, with its individuals, with its history, with its world. And the myth arose as something larger than any individual creator or any individual set of purposes, to go to Anna's point. Some people thought they were going to do something didactic, some people thought aesthetic, some people were trying to record history, lots of people were trying to do different things, and over time the myth evolved into something larger than any of those purposes. And any story that doesn't have that larger than purpose quality can't be a myth. It's too limited. Dowdy, then James, then Joe, then Anna.
Yeah, guys, can you hear me?
Hi, Dowdy.
Hi, quick question. And I guess this is one of the the things that a question that I have almost every week when coming to this group is how, when we're like waist deep in modernity, can we look around and say that we're devoid of myth? And as you mentioned, it's sort of a building of stories. And one of the, I'm also in another group that's just going back and forth between both testaments of the Bible. And who's to say that we're not gonna, like, I don't know, 200 years from now, people aren't going to collect, say, like, ooh, here's something written by Nietzsche, and let's put him in a book with James Joyce, and let's put him in a book with Virginia Woolf, and here's the myth of modernity. It seems like we're just in a time period, like a really, really sick day for the species. Like, we're still there, we're still like doing something, we're still standing on the shoulders of giants. As you mentioned, we're so mechanical, like we can explain the shit out of environmental issues, but we haven't really figured out how to do anything about it. And I think that's where the myth is lacking. Like, we're lacking that sort of, that spiritual awakening of like, ooh, let's like do something now. We sort of have it, but it's still very like sad, depressed, and nihilistic, and like we're really bedridden. But we're still there, we're still creating the myth. And one of the things that I'm wondering is, and again, going back to that first question, how can we look around in the time that we're in, which again, waist deep in modernity, most would say neck deep, and sort of try and point to the fact that there is, like, we are the anti-hero, or all we can create are anti-heroes. We can't create any heroes anymore. Like, we can create anti-myths, but we can't create myths anymore. And it's difficult because like even anti-myths are like the space between words in a sentence. It's very necessary. It holds a sentence together. And without it, you wouldn't have a sentence, but it's not there. So I'm wondering, like, how those, if I'm even asking the right question.
It's a great question. I mean, it's like, how do we get out of this? How do we create, in Hegel's sense, of course, what we're talking, and I guess this underscores what Anna said earlier, we're not seeking to go backwards. We're not seeking to just move along time to an earlier time that we liked, because we developed from where we were to where we are for reasons. And this is something you brought up in previous weeks too, Dowdy, that we're not here by coincidence. That this was the unfolding of a previous order, and that was the unfolding of a previous order. The question is, where do we go from here in a way that preserves what's healthy and replaces what's sick? So that we escape the restrictions that are imposed by the way that we conceive of the world now, but in a way that carries forward the deeper roots. Because certainly part of what makes myths is that they have that deeper ontology to them. To use not the philosophical term, but the biological term. As the embryo going through its successive stages has an ontogeny that it is unfolding. So too our culture and our relationship to stories and to each other and to the world is unfolding in stages. And so the first thing that we can say is that the way forward isn't to sit down with a drafting board and our pencils and design work and say, here is the new culture that we will all move to, and then teleport ourselves into that culture. Or likewise, it can't be as trivial as we're going to fight a revolution, and after we overthrow the bad guys, we will then step in one bold step from who we are now to the new utopian future that is totally different from what we have, because that's not how any living system works. Right? It's what's gonna happen to move us back to a new order of kind of a healthier, more sustainable, more mythic stage is going to have to be a progression. Somehow we have to find within ourselves what's working and look back to what we arose from to see what was working, and then see how to unfold it going forward. And if I could give you a clear answer about what that looked like, we'd probably be already in the process of doing it, because that's probably what it would take for me to see it. One of the things that's the hardest about the unfolding of history, as well as the development of myths, is that so much of it is not by conscious design, but is through successive adaptation and through the results of us working together in ways that produce phenomena that we could never have foreseen separately, because those interactions are so complex, they produce a new higher level order. So it takes us back to Kierkegaard again, where although we have to live life forward, we're not really going to understand how we got there until we look back at it and go, oh, that was how we got here. I know it's not a satisfying answer, and I think I urge you to keep asking this question week after week, because we're going to be able to take new nibbles at it every week, I think, and see a little bit more. We had a whole bunch of hands. I've just about lost track who went first. Anna was pretty early, but I think it was James, then Anna, and then it's either.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting that Freud, went all the way back to the pre-Socratics, to put the Oedipus, use Oedipus right in the middle of his psychological system of,
yes,
of who we are, and that's sort of kind of indicating that we have this major problem, in our subconscious, and that that myth, sort of explains kind of who we are, and maybe it's a warning. And then Jung, said that there were more of these myths that that also are there, that if we could, know them, or be aware of them, and make them relevant to our lives, we might learn something to get us out of our problems. So it's kind of interesting that that for them, both of them, this kind of idea of myth is very relevant to kind of explain who we are, and maybe an indication of how we could solve our problems.
Yeah, part of what's interesting about this is that, like Hegel and Shakespeare, Freud found an enormous amount of creative insight came from going back to the Greeks. Now, for us, it's a cliche that the Greeks are a touchstone for us in understanding ourselves in the world. And it's become such a cliche that we don't know why we keep doing it. On the one hand, people say, well, maybe it's just arbitrary and it's because we're white people going back to some other white people and saying that they were the beginning because we don't want to look around ourselves in the world, or, and that there's no reason for it other than that we do it. Or on the other hand, if we're going to exclude the middle, we could make the modernist mistake of thinking that it's because the Greeks were all wise and all great and they did everything right and we should be just like them, right? And you can find people who will make both arguments. Either there's no reason and it's arbitrary and we shouldn't do that, or it's because they got everything right. They're Hellenophiles who just love everything about the Greeks. But the truth is it's more complicated than that. It's somewhere in that excluded middle is the truth of why we keep going back. But the fact of it deserves attention, because when you look at what Hegel does to Kant as a result of reading Heraclitus, and what a revolution it is in the creation of dialectical philosophy, and then you look at what happens when Freud goes back to the Greeks and says, what if instead of one mind with one set of thoughts, what if we have conflicts? What if there's conscious and unconscious conflicting with each other? What if and he creates a triad, right? He creates his concept of a dialectic between the ego and the superego, struggling within us to make decisions and prioritize and choose what we're going to do. He gets this explosion of fertile insights as a result of tapping into the same vein that Hegel's tapping into. And what's ironic when you look at Freud is the extent to which, on the one hand, just as Heraclitus warns us, Freud is looking right at what the Greeks are saying, but then interpreting it in a modernistic, mechanistic way. He's making a steam engine of the mind, right? You have to let off the steam, you have to transform the steam, you have to move the steam. He's thinking in terms of, 19th century industry, and not actually in the terms the Greek themselves thought of it as. He's not really seeing the living organism of the mind the way that the Greeks would have if they were doing what he was doing at that same time. He's translating it all into his thing. Richard, go ahead, but then Anna.
Yeah, so am I allowed to screen share? Let me see here.
I hope so.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Let me. Okay. Are you guys able to see my screen?
No.
It's black.
No?
There, yes.
Okay.
There we
go. Okay, so this is from the René Girard book that I'm studying in another group, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. And it's touching very much on the subject of Freud. So sorry, that's why I kind of wanted to jump in here.
Sure.
And I think, I think it's Girard is not denying that Freud is onto something, but that I think, it's similar to we need to see this as part of a whole. And so Let me start reading from. Okay, this. So what he's saying is that like we sort of get like the term sadomasochism kind of wrong, in that it's the masochism which precedes the sadism. So he draws from a scene here from Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. The sequence of episodes in Notes from the Underground, I'm just going to read this section here.
Please.
Is of some importance. First comes the banquet, and then the scenes with the prostitute. So the banquet is this, it's this upper class thing that the underground hero is trying to, the underground man is trying to get into, because of vanity and whatnot, and trying to aspire, to this, higher class. And then he gets thoroughly humiliated. And then there's a sadistic scene with the prostitute that comes after. The existential aspects of the masochistic sadistic structure precede its sexual aspects. Far from laying the emphasis on the latter, as do many doctors and psychiatrists, the novelist stresses the basic individual projet. The problems presented by sexual masochism and sadism can be understood only if their phenomena are regarded as a reflection of the whole of existence. Every reflection obviously comes after the thing it reflects. Sadomasochism is a mirror for existential masochism and not the reverse. Once more, it must be said, current interpretations always reverse the true meaning and hierarchy of the phenomena. In the same way that sadism is put before masochism, we speak of sadomasochism instead of masochism, sadism. The sexual elements are systematically given priority over the existential elements. This reversal is so constant that it can by itself serve to define the transition from the true order, which is metaphysical, to these psychologies and psychoanalysis, which are often the very opposite of the truth.
Yeah, it sounds like my kind of book, huh?
Did I stop working here? I'm trying to stop sharing here. Okay, I'll yield the floor to the next person, but my mouse just ran out of battery or something.
If you click share screen again, it should go away.
Yeah, my mouse cursor isn't working. I just need to, I'll fix that. I'll fix it, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Anna.
I'm not sure I gathered what the point of that last one is, but
agreed, Anna.
One thing I was going to say is there are arguments made, the term the Greeks, there are arguments made that the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, Empedocles, there's some others, and including Zeno and any of these kind of very difficult to understand and abstract and rarefied, and they're not presented as argumentation necessarily.
Right.
These are perhaps not the same stream as Socrates and what followed after.
Right.
The thinking is that they are Eastern influenced. The thinking is that they perhaps there was travelers between Hellenistic Egypt and India, for example, and that some of those ideas may have come over from there. And so in that sense, if we say, oh, it all goes back to the Greeks, you also have to explain, oh, but the Greeks, some of the Greeks goes back to Egypt and India. And so, it goes on, once you start pointing fingers at causes, particularly in Hegel, there's no end to it.
Yeah, that's right. That's an excellent point, that I slipped past here and I shouldn't have, which is that, of course, part of what makes the Greeks so interesting is that they wrote through a transformation of their own culture from the archaic and more mythic and Dionysian that the pre-Socratics were writing in terms of, to the kind of more Apollonian, more logical, rational of Plato and Aristotle and others. And it's part of what's interesting is that even when you're reading Plato, who's so influenced by Parmenides and rationalism, he still spends a fair amount of time talking about Heraclitus. In fact, our most concentrated nugget of Heracliteanism is quoted in Plato, and that's Panta Rei, all things flow. which is what Plato said was the summation of Heraclitus philosophy. And so we get this weird thing where when we're encountering the most Apollonian and Verstand of Greek writers, they're often commenting upon the archaic and Dionysian writers who preceded them. And so there's this kind of dialogue going back and forth between the mythic and the logos. That's fascinating. But as you say, Anna, these roots go further back, right? The deeper we go into archaic Greek culture, the more we see things that we associate with more Asian or European cultures. And previously, we talked about some of the books that are available out there to talk about, those connections directly. But another way to look at it is, and I set these aside thinking somebody might bring it up, and of course it was Anna. Yay! There are books that talk directly about these sort of counter-rational, deep, dark roots of Greek thought that the later classical writers often took for granted but didn't expound or unpack for us. And so it means that when they're writing something, they take the stuff for granted that they never bothered to tell us. They might be agreeing with it, they might be reacting against it, but we can't see the agreement or the reaction happening because they don't mention it. So 2 books in particular that are helpful. This one is called The Greeks and the Irrational. It's by E.R. Dodds, and it talks about the counter-rational, non-Apollonian side of Greek thought at some length. It's one of Kenneth Smith's recommendations. Very handy. And the other one,
I recommend that book too.
Yeah. Yay. So The Greeks and the Irrational by E.R. Dodds, and the other one is Moira, Fate, Good and Evil in Greek Thought by William Chase Green. And this is where we talk a lot about how the Greek concept of fate and free will and determinism is so different from ours. We always want to read fate as something imposed from outside, which is a medievalist model, right? Because the alien god who decided to create the universe out of nothing and imposes all meaning upon it imposes his will from outside and his design from outside. And so even in the modernist era, we still tend to think of designs and intentions and fates as things that you impose from without, transcendentally, right? But that wasn't the way that the archaic Greek saw it. They saw fate as arising from character, which is why Heraclitus says character is fate. They saw it as arising from the seeds of order within yourself. The successive unfolding that you're going to do doesn't come from nowhere, and it doesn't come from an outside designer. It comes from the complex interactions between the way that you as a seed of unfolding order interact with the larger whole around you and the ways in which it pushes back or supports your unfolding. And so fate is this very interesting, structured, dynamic thing in the archaic Greek worldview. And William Chase Green talks about that some in here. So these are there's a number of books like this that can start to give you some kind of insight into that older archaic Greek world set. But even in Plato, you can find references to some of the older stuff. And I'm sure that someone like Freud came at his notion of dialectics indirectly like that. I mean, I don't see any indication that Freud read Heraclitus, but he read Plato, and Plato talks about Heraclitus. And from that, he gets the idea of setting up things in opposition and developing a new dimension of order and development. And he comes out of that with id, ego, and superego, just like Hegel came out with his Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft. Marianne, then James.
Someone talk to me?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sharon. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I have because this fundamental, very, very basic question has been really kind of bothering me. And it's a follow-up on what Dowdy said. And we're in modernism now, and the myth has evolved to this place. And so my question is there anywhere along the way with all these philosophers and all their different perceptions that myths and the enaction of them has been perceived as cyclical, secondary to our basic human nature?
Well, the challenge is that most philosophers are writing in the Kantian tradition or some cousin of the Kantian tradition because
Mhm.
we're Apollonians, we're Verstand oriented, noesis oriented, and so we interpret myth as a lie first of all, and then any other flavor we give to it is about what possible mitigating positive characteristics it might have in addition to being a lie. So I cited a couple of weeks ago a writer who's, unfortunately, that's the book I didn't bring upstairs, who wrote about, who did some of the most in-depth writing about mythos in the early 20th century, but even he was writing from an Apollonian perspective and assuming that mythos wasn't something necessary or integral or natural or profound, that it was maybe that's the way the mind was structured, but that it was something to overcome, he thought.
Mhm.
Cassirer,
Mhm.
I'm thinking of Ernst Cassirer, who talks about the symbolism of mythology long before some of the people we more associate with it. So the problem is that this is a neglected strand of development in philosophy. The Hegelians start to get back into it, but the Hegelians sometimes understand it and sometimes don't understand it. Sometimes you see post-Hegelian philosophers trying to talk about the dialectic in a Apollonian way. And even Hegel himself, his own style, because he grew up on Kant and Fichte and Schelling, he describes the myth and mythos in a Apollonian Verstand way. The first time we really encounter modern philosophers who embrace the dialectic and embrace myth and try to put them back together into a really Hellenic take on them are people like Nietzsche and Kenneth Smith. And when Nietzsche does it, he's so dancing for joy all over the place, it's hard to see what he's talking about from one essay to the next, right? He's more taking you on his own personal journey than he is trying to lay out the schema of the ancient worldview. You see it in bits and pieces in different essays, but it doesn't cohere very well. Kenneth Smith tries to actually talk about it directly, but now he's struggling against a whole tradition that hasn't done that for thousands of years. So that's why he draws on so many sources like Hegel and Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and Kafka and the others and Hannah Arendt. He's trying to show how each of them is aspectively, tangentially, glancingly touching on this core issue that for the Greeks was the heart, the beating heart of the whole system, and trying to illuminate it for us. So that's why we're doing this series of seminars. This is like one of the first times someone has tried to take this approach to mythos culture in either in the modern or the medieval epoch. Medievals weren't any more mythic about this than we are.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And of course, part of the challenge for us is, since the archaic Greeks were the ones who were the most mythic of our line of philosophical descent, and they took it for granted, they never bothered to write it down in an Apollonian way that we could understand it as Apollonians and get a entryway into what they were thinking. And by the time you get to the Apollonians in classical Greece, they don't want to do it because they're moving away from it. And so they're criticizing it and saying how, logic and reason are the right way to go. So we really don't have the thing that you're asking for, but we really need it. And going to Dowdy's point, this might be part of the process of unfolding a new culture, is learning how to say and think about these things clearly again in a way that we haven't for maybe 2,500, 2,600 years, if that makes sense. But not by going backwards, just by using those pasts as a referent for going forwards. So let's say Marianne and then James.
So I was thinking about Drate saying that we only have anti-heroes. And I was thinking, wait a minute, we have heroes, but we kill them. So I was wondering why do we need to kill our heroes?
Yes. In I think it's in Otherwise, there is a bitter, difficult parable in which Kenneth Smith talks about he has a protagonist who travels the world looking for prophets, looking for people who speak for God and tell us the sacred truths. And he says he finally learned to find them at firing squads because they're always the people up against the wall. The world doesn't want to be revolutionized. It wants to protect itself and continue the way that it is. And so if you want to see the people who are going to break through the conventional order, especially if they act in accordance with their insights that are so hostile to the power structure that exists, you're going to find them on the receiving end of power, being walloped. It's short, it's brutal, but it's also kind of illuminating, because that's what we did to Jesus, right? And he's not the only one. We have a history of, well, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, right? If you push, the system pushes back in order to try to preserve itself. James and then Richard.
Yeah, Zeno was a student of Parmenides, right?
He was.
He came up with these paradoxes, which were interesting. But is that that's a conclusion? Those are conclusions from that kind of Restant or Apollonian thinking, right? If you assume these rational premises, you're going to come up with these kind of paradoxes that just don't make sense because because you have to like discount the whole empirical world, right?
Yeah, I am so glad that you brought up Zeno. Zeno was one of my first gateways into paradox. And what's illuminating about Zeno is the way he's creating anti-paradoxes, to use Kenneth Smith's terminology. And I think that I can use the example of Zeno to help shed more light on what we mean by myth versus anti-myth here. So it goes like this. Heraclitus argued that paradox, he argued it implicitly. He never comes out and says it. He sort of talks around it. But what Heraclitus says is that from a mortal perspective, nature naturally presents itself to us in subtle, difficult forms, often in the form of paradox. He has, and I'm gonna quote a couple of quick sentences of Heraclitus here. He says, "The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither speaks nor conceals, but gives signs." This is Heraclitus. And the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi is Apollo. And Apollo is not the god of the sun, like the Romans later said. There was a titan of the sun, Helios, who was the titan of the sun. That was not Apollo. Apollo was the god of enlightenment. That's why Delphi was his oracle, because you go there to seek enlightenment. So what he's saying is, if you're in search of enlightenment and wisdom, what you're going to discover is that wise things, true things, don't present themselves to you as true or false. And they are neither handed to you nor withheld from you, but they're presented in a way that's difficult for us to understand because it's intrinsic to the human understanding that we have a hard time understanding the deepest truths. The deepest truths were never structured for our minds to work with. They were structured so that nature could unfold in the way that it unfolds. It has its own reason for being the way that it is, and it has nothing to do with us other than the fact that it produced us as well as producing itself. So as a result, we go back and forth between thinking that the things that we obviously perceive must be literally true, which Heraclitus is saying here in no uncertain terms is not the case. Or we think that the truths are being withheld from us. And he says that's not true either. It's neither hopeless nor easy, is what he's saying. He's saying we have to struggle for the truth. We have to struggle for the truth because of the way that our mind conceives of truths. And so when the wisest things that we can present to human beings to help them unfold and understand the way things are going to be presented like the finger pointing towards the moon, and our temptation is to look at the finger. Right?
Well said.
That's what he means when he says it gives signs. That enlightenment comes to us in the form of signs that point toward deeper truths. But to find them, we have to look at nature to figure out what the sign is talking about. Right? He's talking about a process of decoding. He says nature loves to hide. It's one of my very favorite Heraclitus quotes. And it's an obvious follow-up to that one. Why can't Apollo just lay the truth in our laps and make us enlightened? Because nature loves to hide. Nature is structured in ways that hide the deeper truths. Because if things are unfolding, then the new order is a layer on top of the old order that obscures its source. Right? The fruit obscures the previous existence of the blossom, which obscured the existence of the bud. The process of successive replacement makes it hard to see where things came from and what larger system they're a part of. So these things, and of course, throughout Heraclitus, you're going to find paradoxes everywhere. He'd love to express it in terms of paradoxes. But with these three epigrams here. Oh, and he's sorry, the third one. The hidden harmony is better than the obvious. The hidden harmony is better than the obvious. The thing that you think you see on the surface of nature is not as profound as what you'll find underneath the surface. There's a deeper harmony, which he alludes to elsewhere, that is causing the surface phenomena to occur. If you try to understand the world as a collection of facts, you're not going to get it. As he says, much learning doesn't give understanding. Because under those facts is a hidden harmony. That is where the truths are. So the purpose of Heraclitean paradox, and I'm coming my way around to Richard's thing. It's just going to take a little while here. Oh, no, I guess that was James's thing about Zeno. Is that the purpose of true paradox is to be a finger pointing right at a problem in our perspective that causes us to want to exclude the middle and make it either one way or the other, when the truth is both at the same time. So when he says, you can't step into the same river twice because other and still other waters are flowing on. And then he says, we step and do not step. We are and we are not, right? He's putting a paradox that is designed not to defeat your intelligence, but to grab it against its will and turn it in a direction it does not want to go, and look at a profound part of nature, which is the relationship between being and becoming. Being and not being, which is resolved through becoming. And he's trying to make you stare at it until you get it. That even though your brain rebels and wants to sort it either into it is or it is not, he's saying it is and it is not at the same time. In Lectures on the History of Philosophy, 1825 to 26, Volume 2, Greek Philosophy, this is where Hegel spends a bunch of time talking about Heraclitus and what he thinks about him. And he talks directly about this very point. He says that Heraclitus wields paradox in a way that resolves what seems like the contradiction of being and not being. He says previous philosophers got stuck on things either are or are not. And he says later philosophers also got stuck on that. He says Kant got stuck on that. Things are true or false. It's got to be one or the other. And he says the genius of Heraclitus, which you almost never see in other philosophers, is that he resolves the contradiction by showing that the contradiction is not arbitrary and is in fact organic and necessary to the whole, and that the resolution of the paradox is the creation of the new order through the process of becoming. And that's why he says, in my logic of philosophy, says Hegel, I inserted Heraclitus as the third step after being and not being, as the resolution to the two, to show how to transcend Kantianism and how to transcend Platonism and Parmenideanism and so forth. And if you read his, logic of philosophy, you'll see it. It's right there, the science of logic. So I'm still working my way around to what James said. So the point is, true paradox is used to illuminate the mind by pointing it at the critical, deeper structures of nature that our mind would otherwise shy away from, but that we can't understand nature without looking squarely at, right? That's the point of paradox, not to defeat the mind, but to enlighten it, to show the thing that's hard for us to understand in a way that we can see the difficulty, so that it encourages us to transcend it and to persevere and to see what's going on underneath. Zeno and the other Neo-Parmenideans who followed Parmenides did the opposite. There's a book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, written by Douglas Hofstadter. I don't know how many of you have read it, but boy, was it one of my formative influences in my teen years. It was my first exposure to Zeno's paradoxes. In it, he talks about Gödel, he talks about the artist the mathematician Gödel, the artist Escher, and the musician Bach, and he uses them to show ideas like recursion that are normally difficult for people to think about, or variation or inversion, to show the relationships between things that might look different but are actually related to each other. That's what Douglas Hofstadter's doing in this book. And he shows it to us musically, he shows it to us artistically, he shows it to us mathematically, and he does it a lot by quoting Zeno. He quotes a lot of Zeno's paradoxes. He tries to get you to understand what Zeno's talking about in these paradoxes. For those who haven't heard, a classic Zeno's paradox is this one. Zeno denies the possibility of motion. Parmenides was the philosopher whose core philosophy was being is. This is the very heart of Parmenides, according to Parmenides. Parmenides says he had an earlier philosophy, and if you're not able to handle his new philosophy, then his old philosophy he supposes as good as you can come. But Parmenides commenting on himself is pretty arrogant. But if you can manage to overcome Parmenides' earlier philosophy, he prefers that you follow his new philosophy, which he says is the ne plus ultra of all philosophy, and no one need look anywhere else for ideas. This is Parmenides on himself. And what he says is his new philosophy is being is. And by being is, he means absolute, unchanging, perfect existence is possible. In fact, is not only possible, but is the only thing that's real. And that all change is an illusion. So when you read Plato later on talking about the flickering of the shadows on the cave wall, right? What he's saying is we only think things are moving and changing. He's trying to illustrate Parmenides. He's saying all the things that seem to be changing and shifting, they're not really real. Ignore all that. Ignore your lying eyes and trust my system for describing reality. And in my system for describing reality, there is a universe of ideal forms of which we are merely the shadows. And those forms never change, and they are perfect. And they live in the heavens, and we are their little motes and beams and scintillations. This is Plato's schema derived from Parmenides' being is. And I stress it to try to underscore just how counterintuitive and counter-realistic, how irreal this philosophy is. So Parmenides, being an archaic philosopher, was up against all these naturalists all around him who were like, are you kidding me? Right? Their whole religion, their whole philosophy is based on the empirical world and not based on our systems of ideas. But Parmenides wanted to defeat all of that. He wanted to show them that they're all wrong and he's right. And so the way that he did it was to set up little logical puzzles for them, to screw with them. And Zeno is the most famous for screwing with people with little logical puzzles that lead to paradoxes, or rather to fake paradoxes. Because they defeat the mind and lead you to say, well, I guess you must be right, Parmenides. There must only be existence and nothing else must be real. There must be no change. So here's an example. Zeno attempts to disprove motion. He says, I know you think you're walking places, but it's impossible. You aren't going anywhere. There's no actual motion. Don't believe your eyes. Don't believe your life experience. He says, I'll prove it to you. He says, before you can walk across the room, you have to walk halfway across the room. Right? And it gets people to say, okay, it's true. I have to go halfway before I can go to the second half. He says, okay, so far so good. But before you can walk halfway across the room, you have to walk halfway across that distance. And people are like, okay, where are you going with this? And then he says, I can divide things in half an infinite number of times. Therefore, there is an infinite distance between you and the other side of the room. Therefore, and nobody can cross an infinite distance because we are finite mortals and we don't live that long. Therefore, you can't cross the room. This is a classic Zeno's paradox, and it's cited in Gödel Bach. And the point of it is not to illuminate the truth of reality. It's to defeat the proponents of change who say, look, we see change around us all the time, so it must be real. Parmenides and Zeno say, no, it's not real. Through defeating your ability to explain why you're able to walk across the room, I will get you to surrender to my assertion that it's impossible to move or change, and that nothing ever moves or changes, and that there's only eternal existence. So this is Zeno. And this is what I mean about the difference between his paradox and Heraclitus's paradox. Because the purpose of Zeno was to trip you up and make you fall on the floor and be abject and give up and submit to Parmenides' greater wisdom. And the point of our Heraclitus's paradox is to turn you away from Heraclitus, away from Zeno, away from Parmenides, and away from your own ideas, and look squarely at reality and see how the most profound things about reality defy our ability to describe them in simple human terms. We step and we do not step at the same time into the same river. Not only is it changing, we're changing. We're inhaling and exhaling. The molecules in our body are being replaced. We're thinking different thoughts as we move. We're becoming a new person, like the ship of Theseus, in which each board is replaced one by one. And we keep asking the question after each one, is it still the ship of Theseus or is it a new ship? And the answer is yes and no at the same time. It is the same and not the same at the same time. And that is actually true, despite the fact that it's difficult for us to understand or accept from a mortal perspective. And that's how the river is. And that's how the dialectic is. That the flower and the bud, The flower is the bud and not the bud at the same time. The fruit is the flower and not the flower at the same time, because they're part of a larger system and they can't be understood in isolation the way that Oedipus tried to understand himself in isolation. It's not enough. We have to transcend the individual and see the larger system and see the relationship between the system and the individual and the transformations over time in order to be able to answer even the simplest questions like, can I cross a room?
Is that I know I'm kind of cutting, but is this the heart of Gödel's incompleteness theorem in a way? The same type of thinking?
So this Douglas Hofstadter is bringing Gödel to bear on this.
On the with this. All right, I don't want to go too down.
But certainly it's related, right? Because Gödel's incompleteness theorem is that we will never be able to come up with a perfect theory that exactly models what it's supposed to model. It will never include, and he does it by saying, if we're making a model that tries to include some phenomena and exclude others so that it's describing a part of reality, what we'll discover is no matter how smart we are, no matter how much math we know, no matter how much logic we come up with, no matter how organized and systemic we are, our model will always be different from the reality. It will always exclude some things it should have included, and it will always include some things it should have excluded. The very act of making a model casts a shadow upon the thing we're trying to describe. And so he's critiquing rationalism from a very mathematical perspective, but he's critiquing rationalism in an analogous way to the way that Hegel critiqued rationalism and Heraclitus critiqued rationalism. So you're right, it's related.
That's an argument against any complete theory.
Yes.
And
yes.
if you come up with a complete theory you can't, because it won't be consistent.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. The brilliance of Gödel is that his brilliance is that he was able to do it mathematically, right. To prove it mathematically, to prove that every theorem is incomplete inherently. And that was a massive blow against 19th century science and philosophy, which up until that point had really thought that we would be able to come up with a theory of everything.
Right.
That there's no reason we couldn't do it. And he was able to prove mathematically that it's impossible. Every theory will necessarily be incomplete. At least it will be incomplete. It may also be incorrect in other ways, but it will at least be incomplete, which is a form of incorrectness, which means we'll never have a perfect theory. Which means, again, it underscores the importance of separating reality from our model of reality and understanding that they're two different things, just like Heraclitus told us.
So wouldn't that argue against Hegel's notion of absolute?
Well, this is where the translations are getting us into trouble again, because when he refers to the absolute idea, is he talking about an idea in our head, or is he talking about Heraclitus's logos, the absolute truth that is in the cosmos implicitly, inherently?
Mm-hmm. And before we move on, I actually have another meeting at 1 o'clock. So I have to say again that, in my opinion, you're butchering the ancient Greeks, and I always have a real problem with your interpretation of them. However, I see that it's part of a larger project, and it makes sense as a, creatively. So, I'm willing to go along with it, but it really does make me uncomfortable. So I hope people will do some primary source reading themselves, and
I second that.
Look into Parmenides and definitely read Heraclitus. The other thing is, again, I really do find this a modernist conversation. There's nothing that's being said here that couldn't be said post, pre-1920. So most of, in my opinion, postmodern philosophy takes all of this as proved, takes all of this as assumed.
Okay, can we assume you're going to bring that complaint every week? let's just agree, and then we can.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful demonstration, and the same reason why people read Plato is because these are eternal questions, and so you can go back and do a creative new thing with it all the time if it's worth its weight, Yeah. And if we are good philosophers, we can always make hay out of something. We can always do, make a different kind of a cake with the same ingredients.
Yeah, Richard, I'm gonna back Anna on this one and say, when I say over and over, I'm not a professor, I'm just a student. I'm agreeing with Anna on this, right? I'm not going to be presenting any of these guys exactly in their own right. And I'm also going to agree with her about the importance of going back to the original philosophers themselves. This is what Kenneth Smith argues, that our goal is not to arrive at some perfect truth that we claim to have, because we're mortals and we're never going to have that. But it's to keep going back to these other perspectives and get better and better at being able to explain them in their own terms, so that we can pit them against each other and against us and get some leverage against our own brains.
No,
So
yeah,
I
that part I have no
Plato,
problem with, but it's
no.
sort of like this modernism critique, and then so it should just be like that whole part. I mean, like we've heard this like a number of times.
Well, I'm just saying, be careful. Take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
We would waste a lot of time going down these rabbit holes if we wanted to, and that wouldn't let us get to the larger project of the Kenneth Smith if we were arguing every single point of it. So that's why I don't. But I'm just putting a little warning flag up to people and saying, do your own research.
Yeah, even if it annoys Richard, I'm all in favor of that as a regular warning, because yeah, we're just coming at this from certain angles, and there's more to it. Parmenides, for example, has a whole second philosophy that he developed earlier in his life, and it's different from the one that he had later. So it's well worth exploring. It's interesting stuff. And likewise Plato. Plato was torn between Parmenides and Heraclitus. He studied Heraclitus in his youth, and he spends a great deal of time talking about Heraclitus. So his approach to Parmenideanism, even when he's trying to be a Parmenidean, isn't exactly what Parmenides or Zeno would have said, because he's been partially Heraclitinus, and he's been partially Socratized and partially, made Verstant and Noetic. So each of these guys is interesting in their own rights, not just as a foil for me to use in an argument like this. I'm with you, Anna.
Thank you. See you later.
Sure. So Richard, then Sharon, then Joe.
Okay. Okay, so my original point was supposed to be about heroes and Dostoevsky, so let me get to that, I guess. But I guess first of all, like in response to the discussion about the paradoxes, like Zeno's paradox it's almost a kind of like intellectual nihilism.
Yes.
And like I cause enough confusion, and then I win by default if you can't sort it all out.
That's exactly what he was doing on purpose.
I don't know if this is interesting to people or not, but like, I guess one of the most interesting paradoxes I pointed out recently to someone is, so I don't know if anyone has been following, news outside this country, but so in the Netherlands, they've been having a lot of massive demonstrations, protests, and even some rioting in response to strict COVID lockdowns recently imposed. And I guess it came as a surprise to, even like myself as well, is that actually, kind of maybe in contrast to some of its neighbors, the Dutch culture are quite individualistic, almost a little bit akin to kind of Americans, a little bit as a exception amongst kind of Europeans. And sort of the interesting paradox is we're highly individualistic, and we need to we need to protect that as part of our being. And the way we exercise that is by protesting because everyone else is. And that's sort of I thought it was sort of an interesting paradox, but.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good one.
Okay, so about heroes, you mentioned kind of finding them kind of on the firing line. So I don't know if people are kind of aware, but Dostoevsky, he was actually arrested for his political activities, and he was about to be executed on the firing line, and it was basically kind of at the last minute, he was basically lined up, when they're going to shoot him, and at the last minute, they got orders that he was going to be commuted, and he was going to serve time in a Siberian prison,
Yeah.
And so the one of the books that he writes, The Idiot. I'm just going to read the kind of a couple lines from the synopsis. Just
please do.
He's a young man whose goodness, open-hearted simplicity, and guilelessness lead many of the more worldly characters he encounters to mistakenly assume that he lacks intelligence and insight. So that's the reason for the title, The Idiot. And this is kind of out of, I guess, it also says here that, Joseph Frank describes The Idiot as the most personal of all Dostoevsky's major works, the book in which he embodies his most intimate, cherished, and sacred convictions. And it kind of comes from sort of, I guess, kind of a moment of clarity, lucidity, whatnot, just kind of like, thinking that your life is about to end soon, like, on the firing squad, and then finding out that, he's been given a second lease on life.
Yes.
One of the books in the later group we're going to read is it's The Demons or the Possessed, which kind of talks about like this chaos that happens like in this political movement amongst the younger generations. And it's interesting like that, like, Dostoevsky sees, that like the people kind of creating this chaos in the society and kind of hoping for like a revolt. It's sort of, he sees himself like as a younger man, like potentially he could have been, Stavrogin or like, and so it's an interesting, I think, like in like Dr. Cornel West and others, like, really highly recommend reading Dostoevsky, like especially for the times we're in.
Yeah. Yeah, Kenneth Smith loves Dostoevsky. He's one of the sources that he uses, and it surprises a lot of philosophers of a more academic bent that Kenneth Smith pulls Kafka and Dostoevsky in every bit as much as he pulls in, Hegel or Hannah Arendt or others, because he says these two writers really were critics of modernism in a way that most modern philosophers aren't, and that they had some of that Greek perspective that's sort of contra-modern. And it often led them to present difficult from our perspective, difficult works, but highly illuminating ones. Since you brought us back to this, and since Dave was just talking about, focusing more on Kenneth Smith, just for a moment, I'm going to bring up the one I was talking about from Otherwise, this parable on the screen. And for those who might be on audio, I'm just going to go ahead and read it out. It's called Exit Interviews. It's parable number 44 from Otherwise. Mm-hmm. And it reads as follows. He waited some days by the scaffold and some by the pockmarked bloody wall. Always they announced an execution, for the purpose was to serve up an example to the public. And always he came to get close, to be touched and looked at, perhaps to be granted a word. The guards tolerated him only because of a false excuse he'd foisted on them, saying he was interested in how men died. The guards thought him macabre, but believed he appreciated the artistry of their methods. Had he told them the truth, they would have driven him away or shown him the methods more directly. For he wanted to see the Savior of the world. And where else to go to meet the Savior but the place where the world took action to save itself from saviors? Already in his not-so-old life, he'd met 17 saviors. He'd learned to see it in their eyes. And he'd learned to read the grim business in the firing squad's eyes, who yearned always to follow, but, after all, had to have jobs. The soldiers' expression reflected the severe eyes of their officers, who believed even more intensely in the creed that made the world it was, a creed that there can be no such thing as salvation. They would make sure. In every age so far, they had. So that was what I was alluding to, and what kind of, Richard, when you bring in Dostoevsky, there's like no doubt in my mind that as Kenneth wrote this, he was thinking about Dostoevsky, because Dostoevsky, like Heraclitus, is one of Kenneth Smith's core touchstones. He goes back to over and over for his perspectives on things. So, anyone else have their hand up, or should we do a little dialectic, and maybe we've got enough time. I think we can wrap up the Heraclitus's dialectic this week and go back to the text of the book next week, if you all are game.
Yes.
So, all right. So I'm gonna bring up first Kaufman's comment about Hegel's metaphor of the bud, the blossom, and the fruit as the representation of Hegel's dialectic, which Hegel says he got from Heraclitus. Kaufman on this subject says the following interesting thing in his notes. He says, this is one of the most interesting and fateful paragraphs in Hegel's writings. He says, in Descartes, Hobbes, and Spinoza, in Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, or in Kant, we find no comparable conception of philosophical disagreement or the progressive development of the truth. Different philosophies, according to Hegel, are not to be viewed as laid out next to each other in a spatial arrangement. They cannot be fully understood as long as their temporal relationship is ignored. Studying a single system is like studying, say, a blossom. The study of the whole plant and of living organisms corresponds to the study of the development of philosophy to the present time. Different philosophies represent different stages of maturity. So this idea that Kaufman puts his finger on this as the most illuminating way to understand Hegel's dialectic, and Hegel's dialectic as this organic unfolding of biological order in the form of a mind or in the form of history or in whatever place you apply it in philosophy as being the most important core part of Hegel is to the point. This is why he didn't like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Kant's system, which could be any things in opposition that have to be resolved somehow into a new synthesis. For Hegel, as for Heraclitus, the things that are in opposition that drive the structure of reality and its development are not things that just happen to be opposed to each other through some kind of a schema imposed by the philosopher or the rationalist who wants to have a conflict. He says that is when Kenneth Smith says all philosophy is either existential or escapist, this is what he means. Existential philosophy does what Hegel says here. It deals with the actual nature of the thing itself, not with our Verstand noetic ideas that we impose upon the thing. We have to develop our philosophies about things out of the substance of the things themselves. And according to Heraclitus, the intrinsic logos, the intelligence that is within them already, waiting for us to discover it or not discover it or misunderstand it. It says, but what we are taught to do in academia is to memorize a schema that is correct and to impose that schema upon the world and sort the world in the Procrustean bread of our minds to fit that schema, and to push into the background all the things that don't fit it and pull into the foreground the things that do, and to thereby conclude that we have reached evidence-based conclusions when what we've actually done is cherry-picked the evidence to make it seem like it holds together while suppressing all the evidence that shows that it doesn't. You see what I mean? And when Kenneth Smith says this, he's echoing Hegel when Hegel deeply, witheringly criticizes Kant and other rationalists. He's saying they are arbitrary escapists who impose their own schemas on the world rather than doing justice to the rights of the question itself, rather than attending religiously to the true order that is intrinsic in nature, whether we find it there or not. That was always there before people came along and will be there long after we're gone. Joe, you had your hand up.
Yeah, really quickly. So does this schema then redefines the whole? As it redefines our perceptions of reality, and then therefore it doesn't permit us to come to logical conclusions. Well, not logical, but optimal conclusions.
Yeah, what it tells us is that we need to always make our ideas about the world and our philosophies about the world the servant and never the master. They must always be subservient to the actual world itself, always, which means we have to hold them tentatively and skeptically, as knowing that as human creations, our models and schemas and philosophies are going to be intrinsically flawed, and not just in little details. They're going to be fundamentally flawed. That we use them because they're the best thing we've come up with so far, but that we never fall in love with them and start to think that that's how the world actually is. The world is however it actually is.
And how these subsystems, then we improve subsystems, we actually end up hurting the whole as a result of that, right? So that You're starting to break down the system itself that it's underlying. So because you're proving only what is based on the schema that you've been taught, you're forcing yourself to answer based on a certain specific viewpoint of the world. Therefore, then you're like prioritizing certain subsystems as opposed to the whole, and then the whole suffers.
Right.
Yeah, I see this all the time, and in general, I mean, you could see it with our, economic systems, or you could just see it within ecosystems, or the universe in general, if you really want to bring it that far.
Yeah.
But you can see it even in organizational systems as well.
That's right.
And how these subsystems are prioritized, and they're just misaligned, and then inevitably the whole suffers because you're focused on one particular schema as opposed to the whole itself. So,
I'll give you a classic example, which you're familiar with, which is the Exxon executives who got caught in the email admitting that they knew that their entire industry might be doing irrevocable damage to the world's climate, but that they couldn't stop themselves because that wasn't their job. Their job was to maximize return on investment for their corporations, and other considerations had to be suppressed, even and up to the survival of humanity or all life on Earth. None of that was their mission. Their mission was to optimize the piece of the whole that was their responsibility. And they did a brilliant job at that while simultaneously screwing over the rest of us. And that idea is what Oedipus is about. That if you focus on the thing in isolation, it doesn't matter how accurate you are about that, you're still wrong. When I say over and over that I know that every single thing that I believe is false, people think that I'm trying to say that there's no point in learning or philosophy, when what I'm actually trying to say is that, of course, we have to learn and philosophize and study. We have to do that lifelong, but we must never confuse our understanding of the world with the world itself, and we must never confuse the part with the whole, because it is the organismic whole, the self-sustaining living system that's more important. I'm not important than all people put together, and all people put together are not more important than all life on Earth. The whole is greater. And it has to be attended to and preserved. And because it's so complex, we're never going to get to the point where we can represent the whole thing in our heads. But we still have to try anyway, because the more we move in that direction, the fewer mistakes we'll make of an Oedipal variety, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's the point of learning that it actually brings upon it. It's as opposed to learning is hopeless. No, it's the objective, and understanding a complex system as best as you possibly can is is not only an ideal, but it's also necessary in order for real human progress, not progress by which we define it in our general terms. But
right. And science, the philosophy of science, when it's functioning at its best, this is very close to its heart. That our ideas all need to be tested, and that we must always be looking for better models, because we recognize that the truth is what's in nature and not what's in our heads, that we're just modeling, doing what we can.
And that the question, I'm sorry, I'll stop.
Go ahead.
Fine. Okay, Richard, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I think sort of very much along this lines, of just kind of like looking at your specific area and basically like not thinking about the whole, or like in making subservient considerations about that. I found kind of a nugget of wisdom kind of on Twitter. I was trying to find is to see if someone was quoting this, but I couldn't find it so far. But this very much goes to kind of what Joe and you and Joe were talking about, what's, vis-a-vis Adam Smith, talking about just kind of our specialization of labor and knowledge. So like this tweet was, many people spend their whole lives learning to get good at the game, only to realize they've been playing the wrong game. So like kind of in the aftermath of of January 6th, I don't know if anyone caught this little piece of news, but so if anyone's kind of been following, politics along the lines of like, media consolidation, like how highly concentrated our ownership of media is. But so one of these companies, Cumulus Media, who owns a bunch of like radio talk stations, basically issued a memo that anyone who on the air, espouses, conspiracy theories, questioning the legitimacy of the election would be fired. And I was just sort of kind of like laughing because like, you know, their whole business model has basically been sowing like anger and conspiracy and like mistruth and like it's like and then like, you know, I can imagine all these like kind of young up and coming like Alex Jones and like Rush Limbaugh like wannabes like, you know, like figuring out how to get their ratings numbers up and like, you know, by saying more and more outlandish things and stuff like that. That's how they play the game. And it's like, now what do they fill the airtime with? It's like, but anyway, yeah, that was sort of my.
It's like that flatland problem. I mean, flatland is a great metaphor for human understanding. It's like when you think in a Banausic, noetic, Verstand mode all the time, in terms of what you can measure, that gives you measurable rewards, then, you know, things like the climate or the survival of some species you've never heard of, you can't care about those things because you're obsessed with the numbers and those aren't in the numbers anywhere. But then comes a day which has anybody who is outside your frame of reference could have seen coming a long way off, when suddenly the sphere that was always above you has just lowered enough to penetrate your flatland existence and a circle appears. And you're like, holy crap, now that's real. I'm a flatland thinker and there's a flatland thing. So now there's a real thing there. All this time before, you all said it was real because you looked up and you saw the sphere there. But I, because I don't look up, never saw the sphere. And so I knew it wasn't real and I knew your priorities were wrong. But abruptly, in a excluded middle either or flip-flop, the moment it moves one bit more and starts to pass through my limited plane of understanding, it becomes something measurable to me. So in this way, I can feed off of anger and hate all I want as long as I'm making money. But the moment there's a public backlash that might cost me money, suddenly the consequences of my actions become measurable and I care about them. But I don't care about them the way a sane human being cares about them, a complete human being. It's not that I say, wow, I've been wrong. It's that I say, I have been right up until this moment. And now I will be right again by responding to this absolutely brand new measurable evidence that never existed before. You all were wrong to worry about this before, but now that it affects my money, now is the time to focus on it and care about it. And I will care about it specifically in the ways and to the extent that I improve my bottom line and in no other way. Because you think that I agree with you now, but I don't. I didn't actually change. I'm still operating according to metrics in a Banausic mode. So this is a struggle that people who don't understand Banauseia have, trying to figure out why people do the things they do in the world, is they want them to have an epiphany where they suddenly think the way I think and see the things I see and value the things I value. And that's never going to happen for most people.
Americans love a redemption story.
We love a redemption story. We'll put it in there even when that's not what's happening.
I've kind of been wondering, like, just like which one of like the existentialists or like philosophers, like, you know, or like satirists, you know, we kind of looking at a ridiculous situation these days and kind of being like, oh man, if only I had lived like longer, you know, I could be here. Or like, I can imagine like George Carlin, you know, kind of having a field day, or like.
Yeah, George Carlin would have a heyday with this. All right, so let's look at the let's look at the dialectic. If you guys are game.
Yes.
I'm going to share my screen and we'll work our way through these. Now, he talks obliquely. He just warned you that he's not going to tell you the dialectic and he's not going to hide it from you. He's going to give you signs, right? I mean, he just outright said, I'm not going to lay it out for you. And he's warning you that he's not going to do it because it can't be laid out for you. You don't think the way nature thinks. He said, even he doesn't think the way that nature thinks. So all that he can do is indicate. So you have to pay attention. And he's saying the hidden harmony is better and nature loves to hide. So he's warning you, you have to dig under the surface. That's why he's even got a quote elsewhere that says, well, right here, number 4, seekers after gold dig up much earth and find little. But they find a little, right? You have to be willing to work for it. And so he's basically warning you, each of these aphorisms has to be worked for. So first of all, of those whose discourses I have heard, there's not one who attains to the realization that wisdom stands apart from all else. It is not one virtue among many. It is the only virtue that matters. All the other virtues are like a means to an end. But this is the virtue that is the end. The whole point of philosophy, to Heraclitus, is to get at wisdom. which is, as he said earlier, as we talked about last week, is not something that human beings have. It's something the cosmos has. So then he says, let's compare 4 and 3 here. Joe, go ahead, actually, before I go on.
Just a question really quickly. Can you say why wisdom is above justice or something like that?
Because it's not possible to be just if you're a fool.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Thank you.
There's a line in Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, where he talks about the fact that some virtues are good in and of themselves as long as they're in balance, but that other virtues only come to life if all the other virtues are there to sustain them and reinforce them. And that if it's missing even one of the necessary virtues, it becomes a distortion of itself. It becomes a vice. So this is what he's saying here, is that all the other virtues, they're incomplete. And the thing that they need, you can't be loving without wisdom, because there are degenerate cases where you will do what you think is a loving thing and it's actually deeply harmful. You can't be just without wisdom. You can't be brave without wisdom. Every other virtue in the absence of wisdom becomes some kind of a distortion of itself. Wisdom is the only one that's sort of self-completing. Sturku, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I have my hand up, but so I just want to make sure, like, all the virtues, right? So we're talking all the virtues being courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, right?
There are various lists.
There are various lists. Okay, I mean, these are the 4 that, right, that like Plato talks about, but
yeah,
all of them coming together.
Yes.
So they represent arete, right? Which is like,
yes.
Okay, and so so what, I guess arete, her representing all of the virtues, I don't know, I'm curious, like, what does that, do you have anything to say to that, or is that, or am I just kind of like making a huge detour here?
No, that's relevant to this. So, what the Archaic Greeks, what the post-Dark Age Archaic Greeks, the Homeric and post-Homeric Greeks were struggling with, is that there was no doubt that many of the people that they were describing from the heroic age of Greece had virtues, and yet armed with those virtues, they destroyed civilization. They caused the fall of Troy and of the whole Mediterranean civilization collapsed around the same time. And so they were trying to work out how could that be possible? How could, in the pursuit of courage, you could cause the collapse of civilization, or in the pursuit of justice, or in the pursuit of any one isolated thing? And that's when they really started to think about this problem of maybe you need things in combination, right? The art of writing tragic theater was originally inspired by trying to take the classical myths and embroider them and illuminate them with a new layer of meaning that showed how having an excess of a virtue, or a virtue in isolation from its necessary components, co-virtues, would lead to tragedy. And so when they're talking about putting the virtues together to achieve arete, that's what they're talking about. They're trying to explore that struggle of what does it take to actually be a good person. And they're really, even though they don't come up with final answers, they propose one answer or another answer at different times depending on the philosopher, they're really wrestling with it at a level that most modern human beings don't wrestle with it. We don't talk about it this way. We don't struggle with it this way. In American discussion of ethics, for example, we tend to treat this like a Santa Claus list, right? I want to be brave and loving and, all the other things. I'll just add them on there, and that would be great. That's all we need. And what the Greeks were warning us is that the problem is that these things are in conflict with each other, right? Heraclitus, war is the father of all things. He's talking about the fact that when you start adding more things together, you create a greater system in which these things are in conflict with each other. And it can only be resolved by creating a greater whole. And so as a result, if you put those 4 classical virtues together and you just put them there, you just end up with a war. What you actually need to do is go through the Heraclitean Hegelian dialectic and transform them into a greater whole successively. And that greater whole will be a new level of order and a new level of virtue that's different in kind from the quote ingredients that we put together. Do you see what I mean? There's a dialectical Hegelian Heraclitean way to look at these questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So he's 4 and 3 here are a paradox when you put them together. Not all of his paradoxes are inside of one of the fragments. Sometimes they're between the fragments. And we might say, well, I often write things that contradict myself. So he probably was just thinking one thing at one time and another thing at another time. But that is not Heraclitus. Heraclitus wrote very few aphorisms, and he thought a long time about them, and he tried to concentrate as much meaning as possible into them and lay them out so that we would be forced to put them together and realize what they were in combination. He's trying to make us live out the dialectic by thinking through the struggle between these different things. And so when you look at 4 and 3, on the one hand, he's saying, wow, man, you could be turning up a lot of earth and not finding a lot. I'm sure you're finding something, but you're not getting a lot out of it. And elsewhere, he has one. I think it's here. Let me see if I've got it here. There, number 6. Much learning does not teach understanding. You can learn and learn and learn and learn things and still not really understand things. It won't make you wise to learn a lot of things. But on the other hand, number 3, if you love wisdom, if you want to seek wisdom, you have to acquaint yourself with a great many particulars. So on the one hand, you have to learn a lot of things, but on the other, there's no guarantee that's going to get you to wisdom. You do and do not need to learn a lot of things to become wise, right? He's setting up another paradox here. And what the punchline here is particulars. This is what Hegel focused on. This is where Hegel's talking about the difference between Begriff and Verstand. He's saying you have to focus on a great many concrete, actual things in nature. He's got a quote elsewhere where he says, you know, it's the things that I can see and hear that I especially value. He's saying, I want to go experience nature myself. I don't want you to tell me your interpretation of nature and then have me just religiously follow that as a belief. I want to go out into the world and get my hands dirty and look for myself and listen for myself and find out that the fundamental philosophy of empiricism is built into Heraclitus. And part of it is right here. So not enough to learn a lot of stuff, but you have to do it. And it's not enough to learn a lot of stuff in general. You have to learn specific, concrete, actual things in the real world. So then there is this pair of quotes here. This is setting up the dialectic. Remember that this is written at a time when gnothi se auton, know thyself, is the most well-known aphorism in the Greek world and beyond. The Persians know about it. Other Mediterranean civilizations know about it. They all know that the Greek kings all go to Delphi before they take a great action to see what the oracle at Delphi will say. And they know they have to walk past the posts that have all the aphorisms on it. And they know the top aphorism is gnothi se auton, know thyself. And specifically, know thyself concretely, right? Experientially, through gnosis, not noesis. So when he says it pertains to all men to know themselves and to be temperate, he's saying we have to go through that struggle. If we want to become wise, we can't do that without understanding ourselves. If we're the lens through which we see the world, and that lens is cloudy, we're never going to see the world. And since wisdom is in the world implicitly, built into it, that, you know, we can't afford to be cut off from that. So everybody has a philosophical and really life duty to struggle against their understanding of themselves and transform it and try to figure out what their nature is. Remember last week we talked about, where is this quote? Here it is. This fragment of this quote. Other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep. And the distraction is to focus on the sleepwalking metaphor, which he does mean. And it makes it easy to overlook the fact that he says what is going on around and within them. And this is right after he said his own method is to distinguish each thing according to its nature. Now we're starting to, I'm stressing these things because there are magic words in Heraclitus that he comes back to over and over that are touchstones for understanding his philosophy. These are the same words that are critical to understanding Hegel and that are critical to understanding Kenneth Smith. The word nature never appears as merely an idiom in Hegel or in Kenneth Smith. It always appears as a reference back to the Greek concept of the organismic unfolding cosmos. Always. It always means the dialectic. It always means all things flow. It always means transforming and unfolding. So when he juxtaposes that first half of the sentence to the second, he's saying that there is nature around us, right? And when he says man is not rational only when encompasses him intelligent, he's saying that nature is intelligent. There is wisdom in nature all around us that is hard for us to see. But he's also saying within us, we have a human nature. There is nature intrinsic to us. And ironically, we are as distanced from understanding the nature within us as we are distanced from understanding the nature outside of us. We are as forgetful and heedless in our waking moments of our own human nature as we are during sleep. So you see what I'm talking about here? There's an epistemology built into this. The unconscious, Freud's theory of the unconscious, is right here in this. He's saying, and it's right at the Oracle of Delphi. He's saying we don't know ourselves. And what we don't know is that we are operating internally according to laws of nature that unfold organismic structure within us, just like it unfolds organismic structure outside of us. And we don't see it inside ourselves clearly any better than we see it outside of ourselves clearly. We have an idea of how we think and who we are, and that idea is as wrong as are our ideas about how nature works. Richard, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
And it's very much like important. And I think like even like as moderns, like we get part of it, but then like we still miss other parts of it. Like that we need to understand like the nature as, as you said, like all things flow as this kind of becoming, as opposed to a fixed nature.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think that's kind of where we often kind of make that mistake. Like this us as autonomous agents, like that somehow just is coherent and
that's right,
and fixed or at least at a given time static, right? Or
that's right,
permanent. Yeah.
I'm going to just take a second and jump away from the fragments to go back to the issue of language. The Greeks called everybody who didn't speak Greek a barbarian. And they argued that barbarians lack the capacity to understand the world. And I guess I need to make some of these sidebars disappear so that we can get this whole thing to appear here. Give me a second. I will do this. No, this. No, yes, that. Okay. I want to give you an example of what we mean. It's easy to assume that we are reading into Heraclitus what we want to see there. But the trick is to understand the things that the ancient Greeks took for granted. And they took a lot of things for granted. And one of the things that they sort of took for granted, but also sort of recognized, was their own language. When they say that everybody else is a barbarian, when they say it's not possible to understand yourself or the world without speaking Greek, we assume that they're saying it the way we would be saying it. We would say it out of arrogance. We'd say it out of ignorance. We'd say it out of parochialism, ethnocentrism, right? That's why we would say, if you can't speak English, you don't understand anything and you need to speak English. We are doing a self-involved, arrogant, egocentric thing when we say that. So we assume that's what the Greeks mean too. But the Greeks, remember, were cosmopolitan. They didn't say everybody else was wrong. They didn't try to wipe out other religions. They studied the other religions and they brought other religions' deities into their own religion. And not in the way the Romans did in order to conquer, but out of a belief that the cosmos is complex, that they have a critical, necessary life and death duty to understand what the big forces in the cosmos are that people are subject to. And if some other culture has figured out one of those forces that the Greeks haven't, then by God, the Greeks need to learn about that. Like, it is a matter of existential priority to learn. So when they say people who don't speak Greek are barbarians, they can't be meaning it the way that we mean it when we say anybody who doesn't speak English is a barbarian. They mean something different. And part of what they mean is that Greek has a structure, a grammatical structure to how words are derived from each other that shows the relationships among those words. And English doesn't have this. We have a primitive version of it that allows us to conjugate verbs or derive an adjective from a noun or an adverb from a verb. And then that's about it. We sort of run out. We just have some tricks in our book to make some simple grammatical tools. But they have the ability to derive new words that create profound relationships between what in English we might think are separate concepts. So here's an example of words derived from gnosis and noesis. And what you can see is that gnosis is not a noun in the way that we think about nouns, because it's a process that produces products. A gnoma is a thought that is produced by gnosis. A thought that you think in a gnosic way has a different word than a thought that you think in a noesic way. If I engage in noesis and I do my left brain rational logical critiquing, then the kind of thought I think is a noema, not a gnoma. I literally say a different word, and it's not just some other word I stole from a back alley from some other language because I needed a word. It is literally derived from the word to think for the kind of thinking that I mean. The ability to understand that thinking involves different kinds of activities that produce different kinds of thoughts that have different qualities that make us a different person and produce a different kind of knowledge is literally built into the grammar of Greek. And all of this is absent from English. Go ahead, Joe.
All right, this may not be a good question, so I apologize in advance. But is this basically are they saying they have a better ontology than, say, what English has, essentially as way of deriving meaning and concepts, so that their words are actually able to be linked with concepts much easier?
Yeah, that their grammar, that the Greek grammar builds epistemology into it from the ground up.
Okay.
And that is built on a deeper layer in which nouns and adjectives derive from words for processes. So the idea that nature is not an object or a machine, but is a process of flowing and transformation, that it's a process, is reflected in the fact that they've got these process nouns all over their language from which they can derive the products of those processes.
Okay.
So this idea of physis as a place that buds forth human beings and trees and rivers as part of its natural process is literally built into their language. Whereas in English, it's almost impossible to say it without a long discussion of, what we mean by the river flowing and all that.
I see. Okay. All right.
So that's what they meant when they said we're barbarians. It's like, we can't say these things. Richard, go ahead.
And I think, I don't know if anyone's kind of seen this in kind of popular science, like psychology, there is very much a debate of fixed mindset versus growth mindset. These are the terms they use. And often I just see people, they get in these arguments, and it's because, they're not seeing how they themselves are changing in reaction to the rivalry, that they get themselves into. And then B, they just argue oh, this person's always like this and blah, blah, blah. And it's this, they speak to that person's nature, but in a fixed way.
Yeah. Yeah. Look at a pair of words here. We have two different ways to derive an adjective from the noun for thought. You can have an adjective that is for things that are known that way, and you can have a separate adjective that characterizes that kind of knowing. So when we say gnostos, if we mean that we know this thing via gnosis, right? This is a conclusion, this is a gnostos conclusion, as opposed to a noetos conclusion that I have arrived at through intellection rather than through experiencing the world. But they've got a separate adjective for when you want to talk about the characteristics of gnosis or noesis itself, a separate schema for deriving adjectives that's used at that level of nuance. So gnostikos is the adjective that means things about gnosis itself, where we're not characterizing an idea we have, but we're characterizing what is gnosis like. So gnostikos and noetikos, to be able to derive these different kind of important but distinct kinds of adjectives from the same fundamental process nouns. We can't do any of this stuff in English. English is sort of a sticks and stones kind of language by comparison. We don't have anything like this. So that's why they thought we were barbarians. So the point is, these are the tools they're using to visualize the world, and you can understand better why their word for nature is not a thing, but is a process, physis, the process, and that the thing is becoming. The word for nature is becoming, which means that the idea that everything is flowing is built right into the core word, which means that although we attribute the river idea to Heraclitus, it's right there in the language itself. All the Greeks, every time they say the word nature, are saying flowing. They're saying transformation, mutation, unfolding, being born, containing the seeds of your future self within yourself. All that's inherent in the word physis. And that's why we are not reading into Heraclitus when we point out these things that are in his aphorisms. What we're doing is unpacking what he means by these words that we would overlook because the English words just don't mean any of those things. And unless we unpack them, we're not going to know what he's saying. So he's saying that nature is outside of us and inside of us, and that we're equally blind to both of it, that we struggle. Our understandings of the world are too literal, and that we misunderstand what we're looking at. So that's why it pertains to all men to know themselves and to be temperate. We have to get control over our appetites. We have to get control over our ideation and our ideas. And we have to study the human nature within us to figure out how it works in order to get that leash on ourselves. This is the Aristic program in a nutshell, laid out in just a handful of aphorisms. The argument that we must transcend our appetites and our ideas and systems in order to seek wisdom is just built right in here. So then he says in number 8, I've searched myself. This is his, as Kenneth Smith points out, this is often overlooked as a trivial, kind of pointless aphorism. So what? But it is his answer to the oracle at Delphi. The oracle at Delphi says, know yourself. And he says, yes, I agree. And I've spent my life searching myself. That's the basis for everything I have to say, is that I start with agreeing with the oracle of Delphi that gnotheseauton needs to be our recipe for life. So epistemology and self-study is built right into this. So now's where it begins to turn into the dialectic. When Hegel talks about Heraclitus's dialectic in that book I keep quoting, Lectures on the History of Philosophy, he takes a different path. And I'll come to that path in a moment. But I'm going to take this path instead. So up above, he said, pertains to all men to know themselves and to be temperate. Then he says, to be temperate is the greatest virtue. Now that's interesting because a moment ago, he said wisdom stands apart from all else. Right? So if wisdom stands apart from all else, how is to be temperate the greatest wisdom, the greatest virtue? Well, because what he's saying here is that, like the way that we said other virtues, when they don't have their companion virtues, turn into vices. He's saying you can never get to wisdom without being temperate. There are other quotes elsewhere where he says how hard it is to resist your appetites and how much people, he says, glut themselves like cattle. They just, whatever it is they want, they do. And how it would not be better for people to get what they want. Our wants are not good guides to the truth or to justice or to wisdom, but we follow them anyway, and that's our mistake. And elsewhere he says a lot of learning doesn't lead you to wisdom. All these other things don't lead you, your ideas don't lead you to wisdom either. What does get you towards wisdom is to put your appetites and your ideas on a leash, to be temperate. Because once you do that, then you create the room you need for true wisdom, which, as he says, consists in speaking and acting the truth, giving heed to the nature of things, to physis. And in order to do that, you have to clear the space in your mind from the jabber of all the appetites and systems of thought you have. You have to pull that veil aside of those two sides of the curtain to be able to look at the world, to calm yourself enough, to be able to listen and to look and to see what the subtle wisdom is in nature that's hidden, that's the hidden harmony. And then, having found that nature, to give heed to it, to organize your life and your laws and your philosophies, not around your appetites and your ideas, but around that nature that you are seeing out there and the logos contained within it. Which he set up above, right? Last week we talked about. He says the critical problem for people is that they pretend that they have a private intelligence of their own, and as a result, they become sleepwalkers in the world, reacting not to the world, but to their private intelligence. And what's vital is that we turn away from our private intelligence to what is common to us all, and what's common to us all is nature and the logos that it contains. So when you put that in combination with this, you can see what he's saying. He says nature is the ultimate source of truth. And we have to get a hold of ourselves to be able to listen to it. Are you with me so far? Sharon?
I just like to make an observation, and I don't know if it's valid or not. I'm looking at all these dialectics here, and I'm thinking about the book of Ecclesiastics and Proverbs written by Solomon.
Yes.
I see a lot of this stuff here.
Yeah.
So am I correct or am I?
Well, it's an interesting thing. You know, the more you look at ancient, especially archaic writings, the very earliest writings we can find from every civilization tend to have a comfort level with paradox and the struggle to overcome oneself to see the world. And it's because, you know, I'm trying to remember who this quote comes from. Maybe it's Gilbert Murray, maybe it's someone else, who says one of the weird characteristics of the modern world is that people of no particular understanding or virtue can nevertheless live what seem like fairly normal lives. And that was not the case in more archaic cultures. When we lived closer to nature, you had to pay a lot of attention to the seasons. When do you plant? You know, when it was time to plant, you could not screw around. You had to plant now. You couldn't just say, well, I don't feel like it. Or I have a theory that I should plant at a different time. If you did, you'd starve. You had to really attend to the seasons. Same goes for like the cutting of the wheat. If you leave the wheat out in the field to dry and it rains, it all rots and now you all starve. So you have to really attend to the weather like a god. You have to focus on, are you going to get enough days in a row of sunlight that it will actually dry out the wheat and leave you enough time to collect it and bring it in so that you can then eat for the winter. There is this level at which the closer you are to nature in your culture, the more nature intrinsically necessarily forms your ideas because you don't survive if it doesn't. And the more sophisticated we've become, the more technological we've become, the more noetic and Verstand we've become, the easier it is to live lives in which we forget all these things. And people stop talking about these things the way that Solomon and Heraclitus and others did. Go ahead, Sharon.
So one of the dialectics here, the know thyself in modernism is the road less traveled.
It is. It is. Because the market encourages us to be extrinsic, not intrinsic. It encourages us to look outside ourselves for our satisfaction. We can be satisfied by buying products or by rooting for our sports team or voting for our candidate, not in transforming ourselves to bring ourselves into greater harmony with the greater world. Because there's no money in that. Why encourage people to do the unprofitable thing that's actually wise and sustainable when you can encourage them to do the highly profitable thing that makes wrecks of their lives? The modernism has short-term goals and it doesn't care if it crashes the economy or the culture or a human personality. So yeah. So this is where we start to get into the core of the dialectic for Heraclitus. He gives us plenty of examples of paradoxes elsewhere, right? The river, transformations, and so on. But here is where he really gets at it. The thunderbolt pilots all things. The thunderbolt pilots all things. That seems odd and out of nowhere. What on earth is he talking about? But in this next quote, he says, wisdom is one, to know the intelligence by which all things are steered through all things. He's talking about that the things that we take as separate from each other are interacting with each other. They're steered through each other. There are webs of connection between things that we don't necessarily perceive, and that these webs of connection have dynamism and direction. That there is, when we talk about that the world is in motion and transformation, the motions and transformations are not a chaos, they're a cosmos. Remember, for the Greeks, that's a fundamental distinction, the cosmos versus the chaos. All these changes don't add up to a mess, they add up to life. And the reason they add up to life is that they steer through each other like in a great dance. We don't run, our conflicts are designed so that we come together into a harmonious whole, and that there is a logic to that. And even if the logic is not imposed from without, and it's not thought as a human thought in an idea, it is nevertheless manifest in the structure of reality, and in that structure, in the dynamism of reality, in the way things transform from one thing into the next thing, and the way in which nature unfolds. There is this piloting or steering function of the logos that controls the flow and transformation. So then he sets up a pair of opposites, and he unites them directly and somewhat rudely without explaining himself. God is day and night. And by God, he means authority. He's talking about the ultimate authority over human beings, right? And of course, in the ancient system, we know that by God, he means the level between man and nature, because all gods are part of nature, as he said elsewhere. So the authority of nature exercised over us is in day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, satiety and want. In other words, not just the things that we want, but the things we don't want are also essential to the structure of the cosmos, and that they are both part of this is right, yin and yang, when we talked about the sunny side of the hill and the shady side of the hill, and as the sun moves across the sky, the sides move, they rotate around the hill. This is right here in this sentence. But the punchline is, he says, but he, that is God, undergoes transformations. Transformations. It's not just motion. When he says all things are steered through all things, they're not just moving. They're also transforming from one thing into another. Now, he's got a whole pile of quotes about how sea becomes fire, becomes air, and how earth becomes sea, and when we read that stuff, it's hard for us not to read it like Thales and Anaximander and the other early Greeks as saying, is water are all things actually water? Are all things actually air? We're inclined to read him as one of those and say, oh, he's just saying everything's made out of fire. But he's saying something more profound. For him, fire is not just something you sit at. Fire is his metaphor for transformation, for one thing becoming another thing. Fire and the thunderbolt, the Greeks thought were the same thing. They thought lightning was a form of fire, plasma. And they are related, we know from physics, even if they're not identical. And so he's using it as his metaphor for change and transformation.
Well, in normal forests, like lightning, and causing wildfires, like that's part of the healthy forest. But in this continent, we've been suppressing that for 100 years.
That's right. That's right. So this is where we're getting at. This is why Hegel says he found the dialectic in Heraclitus, and why he stressed every single aphorism he brought to bear. Because we're saying wisdom is to understand how all things are steered through all things. And all things are steered through all things through transformations, which he does as the metaphor of fire. Things transform from one thing into another through a process of unfolding. And the punchline, here's these last few. 112 is one that almost never gets quoted, but I love it, and I'm starting to quote it all the damn time, because it's how he shows the organicism of nature and the relationship of the part to the whole. The bones connected by joints are at once a unitary whole and not a unitary whole. To be in agreement is to differ. The concordant is the discordant. From out of all the many particulars comes oneness, and out of oneness come all the many particulars. And if you're not seeing the Tao Te Ching in this sentence, maybe you haven't read the Tao Te Ching, but I mean, the Tao Te Ching essentially says this exact same thing, that the Tao is the source of all the many things, right? That the many particulars arise from the Tao, that they're intrinsically related to each other, and that all the many things together are the whole as well. That's what he's saying too. And this goes to, I quoted in previous weeks, the toaster versus the cat. A toaster is actually made of parts. It's a mechanism. It's not an organic whole. But we only call our parts parts. They are not parts. Our bones were not manufactured in a factory and then assembled within us. And if you pick any bone in your body, it is not actually separate from the tissues around it. It differentiated into a bone. It is those tissues. It has just unfolded additional calcified order that those other tissues didn't. They unfolded something else. But it's the same organism. And the fact that we can cut up the organism into pieces and then claim, behold, I have a part, doesn't change the fact that it never was and never will be a part. It isn't. It's a whole. It's part of a system of a whole. James, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't help but think of also, included in this idea of the whole, the one, is also chaos theory.
Yes.
That, that's nature use as unpredictable, and it could, the thunderbolt could be, come out of anywhere, and it could be, it could cause a fire in a forest, but it's in charge, but you don't know.
Yeah.
You can't predict what it's going to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's really revealing about the modern mindset that chaos theory is attempting to tell us that in the things that we imagine are chaos is actually a cosmos, that there are subtle, complex forms of order that looks like chaos to us from a classical Newtonian mechanical perspective, but they actually are order. But since we have no term for that, we just call it chaos theory. We just confront the apparent contradiction that what we think is chaos might actually be cosmos. The Greeks understood there actually is chaos, and that it is different from cosmos, and that the nature of the cosmos, if they knew how we saw the world, they would tell us that the way the cosmos actually works looks like chaos from the modernist perspective, but is actually a completely different kind of thing from chaos, because actual chaos tears itself apart. A toaster is chaos. We call a toaster order, but the more you use the toaster, the more it breaks down. It doesn't create itself. It doesn't reinforce itself. It doesn't unfold itself. It is ruled by entropy, and that makes it a chaos. But a cat is a cosmos, because the cat gets a scratch and the scratch heals. It goes close. The farther away it comes from becoming a cat within the limits of life, the more it returns itself back to the state of being a cat. It is a self-creating whole. Also,
scientists also say that we only understand about 5% of the universe. 95% is either dark matter or dark energy, right?
Right. Well, yes, the problem of how can we account for the way that the universe behaves gravitationally when we can't find that much matter? It's a major problem in cosmology today. And every week someone thinks they have an answer to it, and we don't yet. There's some larger thing. There's some bonus of undiscovered things out there. So the punchline is these last three. Once we see in number 112 that he is not saying something radically different from the Greek conception of the universe, he's just explaining the Greek organismic biological model for the universe as being a whole in which the parts are not separate, but are intrinsically part of it. He then comes to the punchlines. The first is he picks up the same theme from 112 and he says it straight out. Opposition brings discord. Out of discord comes the fairest harmony. When elsewhere he says war is the father of all things, he's again trying to say the same thing. That the harmony of things is created through struggle and opposition. The growth and emergence of things happens through struggle and opposition. As the bones go from being not bones, but ordinary non-differentiated tissue, to differentiating their way into being bones, right? They are pushing away from their previous non-bone state into these new osteo cells. But in the process of doing that, even as they become other from the undifferentiated non-bone cells that they were, they're also at the same time preserving the previous non-ossified state. They've got the DNA, they're still cells, they still have all the same qualities, they've just unfolded new qualities. The struggle between what I was and what I will become is the process of motion, right? That's the process of transformation. So the core sentence in all of Heraclitus is fragment 117. This is the most clear statement of the dialectic he's got, and he does it as a metaphor. People do not understand how that which is at variance with itself agrees with itself. There is a harmony in the bending back, as in the case of the bow and the lyre. Now, the bow is the easier one, but the lyre is very much like it. The bow wants to straighten itself out, and the string wants to straighten itself out if it is pulled upon, but not if it's not. And by stringing them together, what we have done is make it so that the two forces are opposing each other. But they're not opposing each other in a chaotic, destructive way. They're opposing each other in a way in which each reinforces the other. As you pull on the string, you increase the tension on the wood, and the tension on the wood pulls the string back so that if you relax, it goes back to its neutral state. But its neutral state is not a state of relaxation. It's a state of tension in which the two opposing forces have been harnessed to each other to reinforce each other. No matter which way you pull on the bow, the other side pulls back, right? This is how biology works. The relationship between insulin and glucagon in managing your blood sugar is that one of them drives sugar out of the blood into the cells. It tells the cells to pull in more sugar and it takes it out of your blood. And the other one tells your cells to release the sugar and put it back into your blood. So one of them is increasing the sugar in your blood and the other one is decreasing the sugar in your blood. And if you only had one of them, you'd die. You'd die. If you only had the one that pulled sugar out of your blood, you'd eventually die of low blood sugar. If you only had the one that put sugar into your blood, you'd die of excess blood sugar. The only way you can live is if you have both opposing systems harnessed together so that when one pulls too far in one direction, the other one pulls it back towards the living system, the center that sings, right? The harmony of life. It's in the bending back, in the harnessing of these things to each other, that it's possible to keep your blood sugar normal. The same is true of your blood fats. The same is true of your blood pressure. The same is true of the oxygenation of your blood, or how much carbon dioxide is in it. The same is true of every single system in your body that keeps you alive. They are always at least pairs of forces harnessed together to pull on each other. So if you pull too far in one direction, the opposing force will pull you back into the healthy zone. Just like brakes and an accelerator on a car, if you don't have both parts, if you don't have the conflict, then the conflict can't move you back to the healthy zone. This is what mechanical objects don't have, right? We try to simulate it in toasters and cars and space shuttles, but biological systems do this intrinsically and naturally. They create themselves in a way that unfolds opposing forces that harness together to pull the living system back towards the zone in which it can live. And if they didn't do that, you wouldn't be alive. So there's a quote elsewhere he's got where, he says, Homer is mistaken. Homer was wrong in saying, would that strife might perish from among gods and men. For if that were to happen, all things would cease to exist. Just like you would die if you didn't have these conflicting, opposing systems in your body, the universe is also organismic at a scale of complexity we can hardly imagine. And it too is made up of opposing forces that pull each other back and forth. And those systems are what make it possible for the universe to exist. And if they weren't there, there'd be no universe. Just like if you didn't have your internal systems, there'd be no you. So that's why he says it should be understood that war is the common condition, that strife is justice, and that all things come to pass through the compulsion of strife. So you follow this? You see this? You see how Hegel, frustrated with Kant, reading Heraclitus, could see that this system he's describing of forces being harnessed together to create a new, greater harmony is different in kind from Kant's old ideas of you could pit any two ideas together and make a synthesis out of them. He's saying, the Greek idea that things unfold their order in successive generations, so that the bud becomes the flower, becomes the fruit, is already right here. Heraclitus is already talking about it as a philosophy of epistemology and ontology, saying this is how things come to be, and this is how we should understand the world. So 3 hours and 7 minutes we've gone. So I'm going to pause here for questions, comments, concerns before we wrap up. So give you guys a chance to talk about any part of this you want to talk about. Sharon, go ahead.
Where's all of this written down? I find this fascinating. Where are you reading this? Is this from Kaufman?
This is.
Can you put it in the chat so I can look it up,
I will
please?
put that in the chat. Let me stop sharing.
It's your working draft of the book, right?
No. This is from Philip Wheelwright. So Heraclitus is the name of the book. Heraclitus by Philip Wheelwright.
Thank you.
The only thing that I've done is put them in a slightly different order. But you'll recognize it when you see it. It's mostly out of print, but you can find it on Amazon or other things. It is a simple green book with a simple cover, and it's very short, right? And over half of it is his discussion of these things and his notes about his sources. Because the thing about Heraclitus is we don't have his book. We don't have his scroll. All we have is other people quoting him. And so starting in the 18th, 19th century, Germans especially started running around collecting all the places where other philosophers of the time quoted Heraclitus, and they put together this collection of fragments. And that's what Wheelwright has done here, is he's just reorganized them, retranslated them. And all I'm doing is reordering them and talking through some of what Kenneth Smith sees in them when he reads them, some of what Hegel saw in them when he read them, which informs why Hegel developed the dialectic, where Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Marx and all these other Hegelians derive these ideas via Hegel. And so that when you read Kenneth Smith and he says the word nature, I want all your alarm bells to go off.
Mm-hmm.
If he says a river, if he says fire, if he says wisdom, whatever else he's referring to Heraclitus, because this is his major touchstone. He's just like Hegel, he's going back to this. And so that's why in the end, even though he uses the river you can't step in twice, Heraclitus ends up with fire as the only metaphor he could think of to talk about a world that is constantly transforming and becoming, which is why this quote, "This universe, which is the same for all, has not been made by any god or man, but it always has been, is, and will be an ever-living fire," i.e. transformation, kindling itself by regular measures and going out by regular measures. In other words, regular, it's organized, it's coherent, it's following rules. It's not an out-of-control conflagration. It is a process of transformations in which there are, as he says in the next one, there are cravings for change, and then there are satieties in which things are resolved. And they are resolved by changing into a new conflict that creates a harmony. Sharon.
These little nuggets of wisdom, which is how I see them, transcends so many other disciplines, religions, process of thought, and which always makes me wonder of the nature, the plural nature of life.
Yeah. I mean, when you start to put together Heraclitus's fragments in ways in which they reinforce each other instead of just ignoring the ones that don't fit, when you actually put them together the way that he had to have meant it, it's shocking how profound he is in just a few sentences. He says in so few words things that are so illuminating that so many other philosophers in volume after volume after volume don't even come close to being that profound. And my favorite, other than, that he invented the whole dialectic here, or at least explicated it through his examples of rivers and fire and the bow and the lyre, he describes one of the most sophisticated concepts of free will versus determinism I've ever read anywhere. And again, just like this, he does it in just a few sentences. It's shocking how far we fall most of the time from this level of profundity, even when the most profound of us are trying to be our most profound. You can see why he wrote so few fragments, because how many years and years of work went into each one? trying to figure out how to say something in as concentrated a form as possible. Richard, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, except I'm just sort of bemoaning. I attended another seminar yesterday. It's also hosted on the Seattle and Analytic Philosophy group, and they're reading Hegel. And currently they're like they're reading Geist, but then currently they're referring from Hegel's philosophy of nature. And one of the questions came up from someone that about Heraclitus, and at least from the instructor in this seminar, there was sort of a response that Heraclitus didn't have much to, or Hegel only mentions Heraclitus a little bit, that it's not very much foundational to the work. I mean, I didn't feel it was really my place to contradict. But I mean, I did kind of I did kind of put something in comment, to kind of maybe invoke maybe someone to kind of dig further, but anyway.
Yeah. There's I've gone searching. It was Kenneth Smith who told me that Hegel said that there wasn't a single line of Heraclitus's that he didn't make central to his philosophy. And I haven't found that particular quote in Hegel yet, although I'm looking. Well, one of Kenneth Smith's challenges, I should say, as a philosopher, is that he carries around this enormous collection of quotes in his head, and he can't always tell you where exactly they come from. If you search long enough, you'll find them, but sometimes it is a hell of a search. But what I was able to find is one of the places. This is Hegel's Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Volume 2 on Greek philosophy, and this has an extensive section about Heraclitus. And in this, Hegel does explicitly say that Heraclitus's philosophy of becoming was so profound and important that Hegel made it the very third part of his system of logic after being and non-being. So for anyone who thinks that Heraclitus is irrelevant to Hegel, Hegel explicitly says in this book that that's not the case. That if you're looking for sources, this is one of them. I believe that there's a second place where Hegel writes about Heraclitus, but I haven't read it yet. I haven't methodically gone through all of Hegel's work yet, so I haven't tracked that part down. So we're going to wrap up in a bit, but before we do, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ginny.
No. I just, my belief in your professorship is not changed. I believe you're still my professor.
Aw, well, warts and all, errors and all, I'll do my best. So let me wrap up with a pair of very short Heraclitus quotes to show how once he's got a hold of the dialectic, he then takes it everywhere, sort of pointing the way to what Hegel was going to do later. This quote right here is one that almost everybody ignores because no one has any idea what he's talking about. Even the sacred barley drink separates when it is not stirred. What on earth is he talking about? So Heraclitus's family in Ephesus were, in ancient Greece, the administration of different religious cults or sects or different parts of the religion was the purview. It was inherited in families from generation to generation. And different families were in charge of running different parts of the polytheistic religion. And Heraclitus's family in Ephesus was in charge of the Eleusinian mysteries. The Eleusinian mysteries were a mystery religion that was attempting to explain the meaning of life, the universe, and everything through the story of the goddess Demeter and Persephone. So those of you who know the story of Persephone, the Greek myth of Persephone being captured by Hades and taken to the underworld, and that being the origin of winter and summer, that is a little piece of the Eleusinian mysteries. We don't know exactly what they said. As a mystery religion, they were forbidden to explain it all to us. It was supposed to be something only initiates came to understand. But we know that philosophers like Aristotle would later say that the Eleusinian mysteries were so profound that they were almost the basis of civilized behavior in Greek culture. So they thought it was whatever was in there, they thought it was critically important. And the handful of fragments of the Eleusinian mysteries that have been quoted and come down to us to this day sound a lot like Heraclitus. They're full of paradoxes, for example. And they're full of talking about nature as the source of wisdom and life and everything else, and that you have to search nature to understand it. So we know that one of the things they did was they had a sacred barley drink. It was sacred to Demeter. As they were attempting to explain the nature of life, you would stir this barley drink. And it was when the barley and the other things were in suspension that it could be called the drink. But if you stopped stirring, the things fell back down to the bottom, and so as a result, you had the watery part above and the solid parts below, and it was no longer the sacred drink. You couldn't call it by that name. It would only be the drink while it was stirred. And I'm pretty sure that that was their metaphor for life, right? When he says all things flow and all things transform, I think what he's saying is we are alive exactly as long as these things in us are stirred into dynamic tension with each other, right? When the bow is strung, we're alive. But when the drink stops being stirred and the pieces fall out of it, it goes back to being its parts, like when we unstring the bow. And now it doesn't have the dynamic tension anymore. It doesn't have the strife, the struggle that makes life possible. And thus, it's not alive because it's not the drink anymore. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I heard another metaphor, which I think relates to last week's discussion, which I thought would be kind of interesting to bring in here. And just kind of the idea of like, like ethical use of like psychedelics. And then just also like how we just also talked about here, like how most people are sleepwalking.
Yeah.
And so this was an interview I heard recently. It was a rebroadcast. It was from a couple years ago, I think, with Michael Pollan, who wrote a book on this topic. And he was saying that sort of kind of imagine your mind as a, and I think, yeah, Dave also like, he typed something really good in the chat, like, that neurons that fire together, wire together.
Uh-huh.
And kind of the importance of like unlearning. So like imagine like your mind as like a field of snow, and then like it starts to develop, as you go down it, like different patterns, and then as you get older, these ruts become like deeper and deeper, and a lot of people, they're basically just following these same patterns, these same ruts, in the snow. Whereas he says psychedelics is basically, kind of like, fresh snow, like fresh powder to basically kind of like allow like, now kind of a level field of snow for new patterns to be formed.
Right. Thank you. That's a good one. Sharon and then Ginny.
Back to the sacred barley drink. This is what I'm talking about. The nature of things. When I was in Tibet, the Tibetan monks had a barley drink, which was holy. And it was almost like a brew, and they had to shake it up.
Yes.
So I'm sitting here looking at this thing, and I'm saying, wow.
Yeah.
Is transcendence the word?
Yeah, right? That they both are looking at this.
Yes.
Ginny, go ahead.
The Koreans drink barley.
Aha.
And so I'm thinking, where did Koreans get this? Although a lot of Koreans, including my family, sort of immigrated through, that part of China.
Yeah.
Genghis Khan. Oh, what am I thinking? Anyway. So I'm just wondering, that's very interesting. Barley.
Yes.
It is.
They're talking about barley tea. That's what I grew up drinking, just barley tea and nothing else, for the first 10 years of my life. So I find it interesting too.
Yeah, a lot of these religions independently around the world noticed they paid a lot of attention to the spring and what happens in the spring and what's possible in the spring, because that's when a lot of shoots are coming out. A lot of things, life is emerging again from what looks like death to us. We know that the Eleusinian mysteries were big on the cycles of life and death and life emerging from death, that they're not actually opposites, that they're interdependent with each other. And so the barley is one of the crops that you can often get earlier than others. In the pagan Anglo-Saxon religion that preceded Christianity, they used to eat barley cakes in the spring because it was the only thing that had come up yet. at that point. And so barley, I think for that reason, worldwide is associated with new life and coming to life. And so
this is the kind of like trivia kind of information along with real serious philosophical information. This is the kind of things that Rick, that just, I find it amazing. It's like, he's like an encyclopedia as well as a scholar of philosophy.
Oh, it's a vice. I have a voracious curiosity. Everything's really interesting to me. So I think what he's saying here,
8 hours a day, you must have read 8 hours a day all your life.
when you compare this quote to the one where he says it is in changing that things find repose.
Yeah.
It seems like what he's saying is that we may think that we're just sitting here being alive, but it's not true. The inside of us, what makes us alive is this stirring, that there is this constant movement of things and this constant transformation, and that we live as long as that process continues. And that process generates our life, just like the sacred barley drink is generated by the stirring. And that when the stirring stops, the drink breaks down into its components, and so do we. And so he's talking about the nature of life and death coming from the same source, right? The conflicts, the struggle, the tension that generates life also generates death. And that brings us to kind of the two that I want to end with. He's got a quote elsewhere where he says, the way up and the way down are the same, right? The things that lead to what we want and the things that lead away from what we want are both derived from the same dialectics. Death and life are part of the same arc, the same waveform that creates us. And that's why he says the name of the bow is life. And there he's making a pun. There's a Greek pun. The word for bow sounds a lot like bios, the word for life. The name of the bow is life, but its work is death. So he's trying to say that the hidden harmony in the bending back that makes it possible to create this energy for life is the same energy, the same transformation, the same dialectic that eventually leads to death. That we are part of the same larger system, like leaves on a tree. So he, like Hegel, applied the dialectic to like all kinds of things in quick succession in these short, punchy, poetic sentences. Richard, go ahead.
So like between 117 and 115, like are those different bows, as in like one is the thing that's used with an instrument and then the other one is like 115 is like the weapon?
So they didn't have violins, but they might have had something like a violin. I don't know. But in this case, the original Greek word for bow in both cases is the bow and arrow kind of bow, which he's using as his. But by saying the name of the bow is life, he's deliberately stretching the reference to the object to be a reference for all dynamic systems up to and including our very lives. Just like he does with the lyre. And okay. Presence, I should mention I gave short shrift to the lyre, right? Because if you pluck a bowstring, it'll twang. It makes a note. But a lyre is like a bow it's like a whole bunch of bows strung together so that you can get different notes. And you can play the notes in harmony to create a more profound sound than you can get out of a single struggle like you do with a bow. A bow is a single opposition. And the lyre is a whole bunch of systems in opposition that have been harnessed together to create a greater order. And that's what he's saying is the nature of the cosmos, that it's not just one bow, but it's a whole set of things in opposition to each other, designed to create, when they work together and operate together, you get this great hidden harmony of life.
Because you get resonance between the different strings. Okay, and I think my confusion, like with the bow and the lyre and the sentence together, it was, I think, my confusion was rectified by looking up and seeing that the lyre is mostly played by fingers, like plucked by fingers.
Fingers plucked the same way.
So the bow there is not okay. Like
it's not a violin bow.
Right. Okay.
He's talking about the harmony then.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know why 115 is so profound? The name of the bow is life, but its work is death. And when I think about life, from the moment you are born, you're dying.
Yes.
And so you stretch the bow and that's your growth.
Yes.
And you're stretching it. And then when the bow actually works, the arrow goes from it and the bow snaps back, then you're gone.
Yes.
That's how I interpret that.
Yes.
So when the bow is actually working, it's death.
Yes.
May it be a good death.
It always is.
and that we're inclined to oppose life and death from each other as being alien or hostile things, and he's saying they're not.
Exactly.
The same unfolding, the same opposition and unfolding that leads from the egg through the embryo to the child to the adult is the same unfolding that then leads us into older age and eventually to our death. It's that unfolding process does both things at the same time. The way up and the way down are the same.
Yes.
But
yes.
It is, if you're not exposed to this kind of thinking and philosophical concepts and all that, I think it's human nature for most of us to be in fear of death. And this is another reason I think, when I think of my child, who's not a child anymore, but the way he thinks about death, the way I thought about death for most of my life, fear of death, the concept of death. And if this kind of thinking and philosophy is exposed to younger people, I don't know, I think that could really positively influence the way a younger person lives and thinks about what life is.
Right.
So again, professor. Yeah.
Can I say something though? The concept of death is cultural. And I can say that because I come from another culture. And the culture I come from, when you get old, death is the friend.
Right.
Death is never the enemy. And this is one of the tensions in this culture in which I practiced for so many years, that death was always a struggle.
Right.
And so that's why I want to read this book to get exposed to this philosophy, to all these dialectics, because they're profound. They're very profound.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Yeah, Heraclitus has got good stuff. I mean, the more you see the profundity and you learn his biography, the more you can see it's not an accident that he came out of the Eleusinian mysteries. He was coming out of a religion that was trying to explain the nature of life and death and our place in the cosmos, the big picture and the cycles of life. And it's like, what a great source, a fertile soil for generating a philosophy from. It's like, that takes you right to the heart of nature. Richard, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I kind of missed the moment a little bit, but I'll try to bring it back to us. So like this talk about harmony, and then and we were talking about like the lyre and like that, these different systems. What came up last week. I brought this up, and I think there was one kind of final point I forgot to add on to it. Like the idea of how our music is tuned, like our modern music is tuned.
Yes.
And so this, so back in in the Greek times, so they call these Pythagorean tunings, and so they're based upon integral values. And the thing is, we've moved away from that. With our 12-tone equal temperament, a major third is no longer 5/4, or a perfect fifth is no longer 4/3. They're a little bit off.
Right.
And when you hear say on a magnificent instrument, say a concert grand piano, when you play those chords, and you there's a beat pattern, there's a restlessness to it.
It's not quite pure.
Yeah, but when you actually have it tuned so that they are integral ratios, the way it sounds so incredibly smooth and decay, it's hard to
like nothing else. It's like nothing else. If you
never
haven't heard a perfect pure harmony, if you've only ever heard well-tempered harmonies, you don't know what you're missing. But the moment you hear it, after that, you can start to, as you say, hear the beat in the slightly imprecise tuning that we use in well-tempering. That's sort of
equal temperament.
Equal temperament. Yeah.
So Richard,
yes,
I'm a classical pianist.
Yeah.
I've been about 4 or 5 years old, right? I gave that up when I went to medical school, and I listened to your talk last week, and I'm hearing this again, and I'm saying, what is he talking about? You sit there and the harmony just flows, and you have major keys and minor keys and scales and chromatic scales and major scales and minor scales. So the point here is when we dissect it down to that level, I think you lose the essence of it. And I can't quite get the metaphor that you're trying to explain.
So the trick is to go to Wikipedia and look at their article about Bach's well-tempered clavier.
Say that again.
I put it into the chat.
Okay.
J.S. Bach composed a suite of works called the Well-Tempered Clavier.
Okay.
And in it, he creates a work for every key on the whole scale. Each one gets its own little musical work.
Yes.
And the point was to illustrate how well-tempering sounds. The whole thing was, well-tempering was a new innovative breakthrough. And he wanted to show people what it sounds like. So what you'll find is if you read the Wikipedia article, it will explain what well-tempering is. And it'll also talk about how things used to work. The short version is that in the past, before well-tempering, what people had to do was in between each musical piece, if it was in a different key, you had to pause while a tuner came out and retuned your instrument to be in just that one key perfectly. So what they came up with was a system of imperfect tuning in which it's close to being in tune for every key. And his well-tempered clavier is illustrating that it sounds fine. It sounds fine that way. Yeah. But it doesn't sound identical. It doesn't sound the same.
Like with well-tempering, like they kept for C major, like the major third and the perfect fifths are perfect ratios.
Yes.
So that has a very, and like maybe sometime, like, I don't know if it's easier, like I can demonstrate. So we just take like a couple minutes, like I can just pipe like my audio through.
Yeah, maybe next time.
Yeah. I have to figure out how to get
prep that for next time.
Yeah.
That'll be our little musical introduction for next week's seminar.
In your late teens, I guess you were more focused on accomplishing the art and the performance of it rather than the philosophical well-tempering.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like I often actually use well-tempering or Werkmeister tuning as opposed to the equal temperament. And so C major, has those perfect integral, ratios for those intervals. And because of that, it's like the C major is associated with purity and that joy, whereas, one way to think of like all the different, like the key signatures we have, so like C major, D major, E major, but like, because they're all equally, like the spacings are all equal. And it's like this irrational number. It's like the 12th root of 2, because basically between like one key and like an octave higher is 2, and so 12 half steps up is that 12th root. But anyway,
you're just gonna have to play it next time. This is one of those things that,
but like
words.
This will sum it up before I confuse people with math. I've lost people with math. Okay. One way to think about like all the key signatures now, because they've all lost their distinctiveness from each other than just being like at a different, starting a different frequency, fundamental frequency, is you can think of as all the key signatures sound equally good, but at the same time, all these key signatures now sound equally bad because you lost some of, like say in the case of C major, you've lost those perfect like integral intervals. And then you've lost the ability to have key signature as a dimension of expressing a different mood, field of emotions and temperament.
So, what I'm gonna do to wrap that up this week and reiterate that we should do it next week is a famous quote that's sort of hard to pin down, which is, writing about music is like dancing about architecture.
Yes.
You're attempting to explain in words something that we simply have to hear. And once we've heard it, then we'll be like, oh, that's what you're explailing. But until we've heard it, there's no referent for your explanation. And so we're like,
there really isn't. Yeah.
You just have to hear it.
Yeah. I'll try to
prep
mix your software. If I can't, I'll just record it and then I'll play it back. I'll just share the audio over Zoom, I think.
Yeah. Prep it for next week.
Yeah.
Yes. Amazing. Thank you very much, Rick.
Yeah. Speaking of next week, we'll come back to Mythic Desperation, but now we'll be in the text. And what the homework for you guys for this week is read the text for Mythic Desperation with the things that we talked about Heraclitus and Hegel in mind, and see if you can spot the places in this text where he's not just outright saying Hegel or Heraclitus, but he's using the words and the terminology and the dialectic. Find the places where he talks about nature or human nature, or where he talks about any other part of what we were saying. And we'll bring those quotes together next week to sort of see what this extra layer is that gets unfolded within Kenneth Smith once you know Heraclitus and Hegel.
So where he's using the words of the dialectic, right?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Rick.
My pleasure.
Okay, goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
gotta-
David.
Thank you.
David
Thank
Rowell.
you, Rick.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Rick.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rick.
Bye.
Thank you, David.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Enjoyed
Sharon.
it,
Bye, everybody.
everyone. Bye. Bye, Joseph.
Yay.
Bye.
Bye, Sharon.
Hi, David. Bye.